Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world you won't believe existed. Picture this, it's a crisp morning in 1720, and somewhere in a lavish bedroom in Paris, a nobleman is preparing for his day. But here's the shocking part. Getting dressed will take him nearly 3 hours, not because he's slow, not because he's indecisive, but because his outfit has more layers than a wedding cake, more embroidery than a tapestry, and costs more than most people earned in a lifetime. Tonight we're stepping back into the era when men didn't just wear clothes. They wore art, status, and sometimes their entire fortune on their backs. This is the golden age when men outshone women in fashion, when peacock wasn't just a bird but a lifestyle. So settle in, dim those lights, and let me take you to a time when getting dressed was a performance, and every man was expected to be the star. Before we dive deeper into this glittering world, I'd love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, but only if tonight's story truly speaks to you. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you tucked into bed in California, perhaps sipping tea in London, or maybe watching the sunrise somewhere across the Pacific? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your stories always brighten my day. Now, let the room settle into a comfortable dimness. Maybe turn on a gentle fan if you have one nearby. And let's drift together into the 1800s, where men were draped in silk, gold, and more jewelry than most of us own today. Let me paint you a picture of what it truly meant to be a fashionable man in the early 1700s. Imagine standing in front of an enormous wardrobe, and I mean enormous, the size of a small room. Inside you'd find not simple shirts and trousers, but a collection that would make a modern fashion influencer weep with envy. The centerpiece of every gentleman's wardrobe was something called the habit à la française. Now don't let the French name intimidate you. It simply means the French style, and it was the three-piece suit of its day, except infinitely more complicated. This wasn't just any three-piece outfit. First came the justaucorps, a long coat that fell to your knees, with wide skirts that flared out dramatically from the waist. The coat itself was a work of art, picture fabric so fine it shimmered in candlelight. Silk damask, velvet brocade, materials that caught every ray of light and threw it back tenfold. But the fabric was just the beginning. These coats were embroidered. And when I say embroidered, I don't mean a little decorative stitching here and there. I'm talking about gold and silver thread woven into elaborate patterns covering nearly every inch of the garment. Flowers, vines, geometric patterns, sometimes even little scenes depicting mythology or nature. Some coats had sequins, hundreds of them that glittered with every movement. Others featured what they called artificial gems, which sounds cheap until you realize these weren't plastic rhinestones. These were glass jewels, carefully cut and polished, each one hand-sewn onto the fabric. And here's something that might surprise you. Men's clothing in this era was actually more ornate than women's. That's right. While women's dresses were certainly elaborate, it was men's fashion where the true artistry of embroidery reached its peak. Historians who study fashion from this period often note that if you wanted to see the finest needlework of the 18th century, you didn't look at ladies' gowns. You looked at gentlemen's coats and waistcoats. The embroiderers who created these masterpieces were artists in their own right, spending weeks or even months on a single garment. Beneath the coat came the waistcoat, or as the French called it, the vest. Now you might think a waistcoat sounds simple enough. We still wear them today, after all. But the waistcoats of the 1700s were nothing like what you're imagining. These garments were long, extending well past the waist, sometimes almost to the knees. They were sleeveless, yes, but they were far from plain. The waistcoat was actually where a gentleman could really show his personality and wealth. While the coat might follow certain formal patterns, the waistcoat was your canvas for self-expression. Some men owned dozens of waistcoats. The wealthy and fashionable, they owned hundreds. There's a wonderful quote from 1787 from a French baroness named d'Aubercourt, who observed the fashion of her time with both amusement and amazement. She wrote about visiting a nobleman's dressing room and being shown his collection of gilets, that's another French word for waistcoat. She noted in her diary that it was absolutely trendy to own dozens, even hundreds of these garments if one wanted to be considered truly fashionable. Can you imagine? Hundreds of waistcoats, each one unique, each one a small fortune. These waistcoats were decorated with embroidery that told stories. Some featured pastoral scenes, shepherds with their flocks, country houses nestled among rolling hills. Others displayed exotic motifs inspired by the East Indies, with palm trees and strange birds that few Europeans had ever seen in person. Still others took inspiration from classical antiquity. There are surviving examples with delicate embroidery showing Roman columns, arches, and architectural details. During the latter half of the 18th century, when neoclassicism became fashionable, men literally wore ancient Rome on their chests. And then came the breeches. Now, these weren't pants as we know them. Breeches stopped at the knee, fitting snugly around the thigh, and I mean snugly. These garments were cut and tailored to show off the shape of a man's legs, which were considered one of his most attractive features. Yes, you heard that right. In the 1700s, a gentleman's legs were as important to his appearance as his face. A well-turned calf was something to be proud of, and the breeches were designed to display it. But the breeches were just the beginning of the leg situation. Below the knee came white silk stockings, not cotton, not wool except for the working classes, silk, pure white silk stockings that had to be pulled up over the knee and secured with garters. These stockings showed every line, every curve of the lower leg. And maintaining them, that was a job in itself. White silk stains easily, wrinkles readily, and tears at slightest provocation. A gentleman had to own multiple pairs because they'd need constant washing and replacing. Now let's talk about the feet, because this is where things get really interesting. Men in the early 1700s wore heeled shoes, not small, subtle heels. We're talking about heels that were sometimes 2 or 3 inches high. Where did this fashion come from? Believe it or not, from Persian cavalry. When European aristocrats saw paintings and descriptions of Persian horsemen, they noticed these riders wore heeled shoes that helped them keep their feet secure in stirrups. European nobles, always eager to adopt anything that looked exotic and expensive, decided these heels looked marvellous. Never mind that most of the barely rode horses, the heels became a status symbol, a mark of aristocratic bearing. These shoes were works of art themselves. They weren't made of plain leather. Often they were crafted from the same expensive fabrics as the rest of the outfit: silk, velvet, brocade. And the buckles. Oh, the buckles deserve their own moment of appreciation. Shoe buckles in the early 1700s were enormous, sometimes covering nearly the entire front of the shoe. They were made of silver, gold, brass, sometimes set with semi-precious stones. A pair of shoe buckles could cost more than a common labourer earned in several months. Some aristocrats owned dozens of pairs, changing them to match different outfits or occasions. Let me give you a sense of what all this cost. A fully embroidered court suit, the coat, waistcoat and breeches together, could easily cost more than 10 years' wages for a household servant. Think about that for a moment. A butler or footman might earn, let's say, £20 to £30 a year. An elaborate court suit could cost £300 or more. That's a decade of someone's working life condensed into one outfit. And remember, a fashionable gentleman didn't own just one suit. He owned many. Different colours for different seasons, different levels of formality for different occasions. The amount of wealth tied up in clothing was staggering. And here's something that really brings this into perspective. These weren't clothes you could just throw on. The fabrics were delicate. The embroidery could snag. The fit was so precise that one wrong movement might tear a seam. Getting dressed required help, usually at least one servant, sometimes 2 or 3. The coat had to be eased on carefully to avoid disturbing the embroidery. The waistcoat had to be buttoned, and there were lots of buttons, sometimes 20 or 30 down the front. The breeches had to be fastened at the knee, the stockings pulled smooth and straight, the shoes buckled just so. But wait, there's more. I haven't even mentioned what went on the head yet. In the early 1700s, fashionable men wore wigs, not small, natural-looking hairpieces, enormous flowing wigs that cascaded down over the shoulders and back. These wigs weren't made of cheap synthetic fibres. They were crafted from real human hair, sometimes horsehair, occasionally even raw yak hair, imported at great expense from Asia. The wigs were powdered, we'll talk more about this later, and they had to be maintained, styled, and stored carefully when not in use. The whole ensemble, from the shoes on your feet to the wig on your head, was designed to do one thing: display wealth, taste, and status at a single glance. When a gentleman walked into a room wearing his habit à la française, everyone knew immediately where he stood in society. The quality of the silk told you his income. The intricacy of the embroidery told you his taste. The fit of the garments told you he could afford skilled tailors. The whiteness of his stockings told you he had servants to launder them. Every single element was a form of communication, a visual language that everyone at the time could read fluently. And perhaps the most fascinating aspect of all this? Men dressed this way not for special occasions, but for everyday life. This was what you wore to pay social calls, to conduct business, to appear at court, to attend the theatre. Imagine spending 3 hours getting dressed just to go visit a friend for afternoon tea. Imagine the weight of all those layers, the heavy embroidered coat, the structured waistcoat, the tight breeches, the constricting stockings. Imagine trying to sit comfortably, move naturally, or heaven forbid, actually do any physical work while wearing all this. The women of the era, despite their own complicated fashions, often had it easier, in some ways. Yes, they wore stays and hoops and heavy skirts, but their garments at least allowed their arms to move freely. A man's coat, cut so tightly across the shoulders and back, restricted movement significantly. Lifting your arms above your head? Difficult. Reaching for something on a high shelf? Nearly impossible without disturbing the careful drape of your coat. The fashion quite literally shaped how men moved through the world, forcing them to maintain an upright, rather rigid posture that became associated with aristocratic bearing. There's something both magnificent and absurd about this level of dedication to appearance. These men weren't foolish. Many were educated, accomplished, powerful individuals, but fashion had become a kind of armour, a way of maintaining social hierarchies that were beginning to feel the first tremors of change. The elaborate dress, the expensive fabrics, the hours spent in preparation, all of it reinforced the idea that aristocrats were fundamentally different from common people. It said without words, I don't need to work. I don't need to move efficiently. I exist to be beautiful, to be admired, to represent the pinnacle of civilization. And for a time it worked. The courts of Europe glittered with these peacock men, each trying to outshine the others. The competition drove craftsmen to ever greater heights of skill. Embroiderers developed new techniques. Tailors perfected the art of creating garments that seemed to defy gravity in how they draped and moved. It was, in its own way, a golden age of masculine beauty. But as we'll discover in the chapters ahead, this golden age was already beginning to tarnish around the edges. Revolutionary ideas were spreading. The notion that all men might be created equal was gaining traction, and a young man named George Brummel was about to be born, who would eventually turn this entire world of fashion on its head, not by making it simpler, mind you, but by making it complicated in entirely new and unexpected ways. For now, though, let's leave our gentleman of 1720 as he finally finishes dressing 3 hours after he began. He stands before his mirror, adjusting his wig one final time, making sure every button gleams, every fold of fabric falls perfectly. He's ready to face the world, dressed in a fortune, carrying on his back the weight of tradition, status, and an empire's worth of silk and gold thread. Tomorrow, or rather in just a few moments as we continue, we'll meet the man who changed everything, the dandy who somehow made getting dressed even more complicated while claiming to simplify it. But that's a story that deserves its own telling, and I promise you it's even more fascinating than what we've explored tonight. Rest your eyes now, let these images of silk and embroidery drift through your mind, and when you're ready, we'll step forward in time to meet Bo Brummel, the man who spent 5 hours each morning achieving what he called effortless elegance. Now, let's shift our focus to a name that would echo through history, George Brian Brummel, but you probably know him better as Bo Brummel. Born in 1778 on Downing Street in London, this man wasn't born into nobility. His father was a secretary, a civil servant, respectable certainly, but not aristocratic. Yet somehow this middle-class boy would grow up to dictate fashion to princes, transform how every man in the Western world dressed, and create a legacy that we're still living with today. And here's the paradox that makes his story so fascinating. Brummel claimed he was simplifying men's fashion, stripping away the excess, making things more rational, but in reality, he made getting dressed infinitely more complicated. He just hid the complexity under a veneer of what he called studied carelessness. Picture a morning in London around 1805. The sun is just beginning to filter through the windows of Brummel's residence. Most gentlemen of his era might spend an hour, perhaps 90 minutes on their morning toilette. Brummel, he would spend 5 hours, 5 entire hours, not occasionally as some special preparation for a grand ball. No, this was his daily routine. Every single morning, 5 hours dedicated to the art of looking like he hadn't tried at all. Let me walk you through what those 5 hours actually involved, because it's genuinely astonishing. And I want you to imagine this, really picture it, because it's so far removed from our world of quick showers and throwing on whatever's clean. Can you imagine dedicating 5 hours every morning just to getting ready? Before checking your phone, before breakfast, before anything else. 5 hours of pure, focused preparation. It sounds exhausting, doesn't it? And yet for Brummel and the men who followed his example, this was normal. This was necessary. The ritual began with bathing. Now, this might not sound revolutionary to us, but in the early 1800s, daily bathing was unusual even among the wealthy. Most people of the era, even aristocrats, might bathe once a week, perhaps less. They relied heavily on perfumes and powders to mask any unpleasant odours. But Brummel was fanatical about cleanliness. He bathed every single morning in water that his servants had to heat and carry up to his dressing room. He used soap, real soap, which was expensive, and he scrubbed thoroughly. This alone could take 30 to 40 minutes. After bathing came what he called the full body brush. Brummel had developed a conviction that proper grooming required brushing one's entire body with a stiff, bristled brush. Not just the hair, mind you. The entire body. Arms, legs, torso, back, everything. He believed this stimulated circulation and contributed to the healthy glow of the skin. His servants would assist with the hard-to-reach areas. This process took another 20 to 30 minutes. And then, here's a detail that might make you wince a bit. He would pursue any remaining stray hairs with a pair of tweezers. Yes, tweezers, painstakingly plucking any hair that didn't meet his standards of perfection. Eyebrows, nose hair, any stray whisker the razor might have missed. Nothing escaped his scrutiny. His shaving routine was equally meticulous. The razors of the era weren't like modern safety razors. They were straight razors, incredibly sharp blades that required skill and steady hands to use safely. Brummel insisted on a perfectly smooth shave, which meant his valet had to be exceptionally skilled. The process involved hot towels to soften the beard, careful lathering with shaving soap, multiple passes of the razor to ensure every whisker was removed, and then soothing balms to calm the skin. This could easily take an hour. But here's what's truly fascinating. Brummel prided himself on never using scent. Unlike his contemporaries who doused themselves in heavy perfumes, Brummel believed that proper cleanliness meant you shouldn't need perfume at all. He supposedly said that if a gentleman needed perfume, he wasn't washing properly. His radical commitment to hygiene, the daily baths, the meticulous grooming was his alternative to perfume. And it worked. People noticed. They commented on how fresh and clean he always appeared, even in an age when most people frankly didn't. Now we come to the hair. Brummel had moved away from the powdered wigs of the previous generation. Remember those elaborate white clouds we talked about earlier? He wore his own hair, cut in a style that was meant to look natural and effortless. But achieving that natural look, that took an hour. His hair had to be washed, dried, brushed, and arranged just so. Not too perfect, that would look artificial. Not too dishevelled, that would look slovenly. It had to hit that perfect note of I woke up looking this good. Do you know how hard it is to look like you're not trying? It takes an enormous amount of trying, and then we get to the clothes. By this point we're already 3 hours into the morning and Brummel hasn't even begun to dress. The clothing phase was where things got really interesting because this is where Brummel's famous perfectionism truly shone. Or perhaps I should say, this is where it became almost comically obsessive. Let me tell you about the cravat. The cravat was a long piece of white linen, starched until it was nearly stiff as paper, that wrapped around the neck and tied in front. We'll talk much more about cravats in our next section, but for now, you need to understand something crucial. Brummel believed that the cravat was the centerpiece of a gentleman's appearance. Get the cravat right, and you could get away with imperfections elsewhere. Get it wrong, and your entire outfit was ruined. The problem was, tying a cravat to Brummel's exacting standards was incredibly difficult. The starched linen didn't want to cooperate. It resisted folding, fought against being knotted, and had an unfortunate tendency to wrinkle if you so much as looked at it wrong. Brummel had developed his own technique for tying the perfect cravat, a method that involved multiple steps, precise angles, and a steady hand. And here's the truly absurd part. He rarely got it right on the first try or the second or the third. There's a famous story about this, one that his contemporaries loved to tell. Brummel's valet would stand ready each morning with a pile of freshly starched cravats draped over his arm. Brummel would take one, position himself before the mirror, and begin the delicate process of tying. If the knot didn't form perfectly, if there was the slightest wrinkle, the smallest asymmetry, he would untie it, toss it aside, and reach for another. One morning, a visitor reportedly saw the valet leaving Brummel's dressing room with his arms full of discarded, crumpled cravats. When asked what these were, the valet supposedly replied, in a tone of weary resignation, "These are our failures." Our failures. Can you imagine? An entire pile of perfectly good linen cloths discarded because they weren't tied absolutely perfectly. On a particularly difficult morning, Brummel might go through a dozen cravats. Some sources say he once went through 30 before achieving the look he wanted. 30. That's not just perfectionism, that's something approaching obsession. And this was just his neckcloth. We haven't even discussed the shirt yet. Brummel wore shirts of the finest linen, pure white with high collars that stood up stiffly around his jaw. These collars were starched as rigidly as the cravats. They had to be spotlessly clean. The slightest hint of dirt or discoloration was unacceptable. The cuffs had to extend exactly the right distance beyond his coat sleeves. Not too much, which would look pretentious. Not too little, which would look cheap. Just right. Finding that just right point could take several attempts. Then came the waistcoat or vest. Unlike the elaborately embroidered waistcoats of the previous generation, Brummel favoured simpler designs, usually in pale colours, cream, buff, light grey. But simple didn't mean easy to wear. The waistcoat had to fit perfectly, hugging the torso without a single wrinkle, buttoning up smoothly, sitting at exactly the right height. Brummel was known to have his waistcoats remade multiple times if they didn't fit to his specifications. The trousers, or pantaloons as they were called then, were perhaps the most challenging garment of all. Brummel had actually invented a clever device to help with these. You see, the pantaloons of his era were designed to fit like a second skin. They were made of buckskin or very fine wool cut to reveal the shape of the leg, and they were tight, I mean really tight. So tight that putting them on required assistance. Brummel would have a servant help pull them up, working the fabric over his legs inch by inch. But even once they were on, there was a problem. When you walked, the fabric would tend to ride up, creating wrinkles around the ankles. This was unacceptable. So Brummel invented what he called a stirrup, a strap that passed under the foot, keeping the trouser leg taut and smooth. It sounds like a small thing, but it was revolutionary at the time. Other fashionable men immediately copied the idea. Within a few years, every gentleman's trousers had stirrups. Brummel's little innovation had changed how an entire generation dressed. The coat was the final major piece. Brummel favoured dark colours. Navy blue was his signature, though he also wore dark green and black. The coats were tailored to perfection, cut close to the body, emphasising the shoulders and tapering to the waist. Unlike the previous generation's coats with their flaring skirts, Brummel's coats were relatively simple in cut. But that simplicity was deceptive. The tailoring had to be absolutely perfect. The shoulders had to sit just right. The sleeves had to be exactly the right length. The whole garment had to move with the body as one smooth unit. Brummel employed 3 separate tailors, each specialising in different aspects of the coat. One created the body, one did the sleeves, and one finished the collar and lapels. This wasn't just vanity, it was quality control. By having specialists focus on their particular area of expertise, Brummel ensured that every part of the coat was executed flawlessly. And then, finally, came the boots. Brummel wore Hessian boots, tall black leather boots that came to just below the knee. These boots had to shine. Not just be clean, but shine like mirrors. There's a famous legend about Brummel polishing his boots with champagne. Now, historians debate whether this is literally true or just a colourful exaggeration meant to illustrate his extravagance. But here's what we do know for certain. His boots were polished to an absolutely extraordinary degree. The leather had to be spotless, buffed to a high gloss, without a single scuff or smudge. Achieving this required special polishes, careful application, and lots of elbow grease from his servants. The entire process, from the moment he woke to the moment he was finally dressed and ready to face the world, took 5 hours. 5 hours of bathing, grooming, brushing, shaving, plucking, trying on, adjusting, discarding and perfecting. 5 hours to achieve a look that was meant to appear completely effortless, as if he'd simply rolled out of bed looking immaculate. And here's the truly remarkable part. People knew it took 5 hours. This wasn't a secret. In fact, it was part of his mystique. The Prince of Wales himself, the future King George IV, would visit Brummel's dressing room and spend hours watching this ritual unfold. Think about that. The heir to the British throne, a man who had literally anything else he could be doing, chose to spend his mornings watching another man get dressed. Other aristocrats did the same. Crowds of admirers would actually gather outside Brummel's house, hoping to catch glimpses of him through the windows as he performed his morning toilette. This wasn't seen as weird or excessive. It was seen as fascinating, as aspirational. Brummel was teaching them something important. He was showing them that true elegance required work, discipline, attention to detail. That looking good wasn't something you stumbled into, it was something you built, carefully and deliberately every single day. The cost of maintaining this lifestyle was astronomical. Brummel spent more on his clothes annually than most aristocrats spent on their estates. A single outfit, and remember he changed clothes multiple times a day, could cost 10 times what a butler earned in a year. His cravats alone represented a significant expense. They had to be the finest linen, perfectly woven. They had to be laundered and starched after every use. Given that he might go through 30 in a single morning, the laundry bills must have been staggering. His tailor bills were legendary. He patronised the finest tailors in London, and he demanded perfection. If a coat didn't fit exactly right, he sent it back to be remade. If a waistcoat had even the slightest imperfection in the stitching, it was rejected. This kind of perfectionism didn't come cheap. His tailors could charge premium prices because they knew Brummel wouldn't haggle. He'd pay whatever was necessary to achieve the look he wanted. But why? Why would someone dedicate 5 hours every morning to getting dressed? Why would the Prince of Wales and other powerful men watch this ritual with fascination? What was the point of all this effort? The answer tells us something profound about that moment in history. Brummel understood something that we sometimes forget today. Appearance is a form of power. In a world where most people still dressed according to their station in life, where you could tell a nobleman from a merchant from a labourer at a glance, Brummel was doing something revolutionary. He was showing that style could be learned, that elegance could be achieved, that you could remake yourself through sheer dedication to aesthetic perfection. He wasn't born into the highest ranks of society. His father was a secretary, remember, respectable but not noble. Yet through his mastery of appearance, through his 5-hour morning ritual, through his absolute commitment to looking perfect, he gained entry to the highest circles. He became friends with the Prince of Wales. Dukes and earls sought his approval on their clothing choices. He essentially became the arbiter of taste for an entire generation of British men. There's a wonderful anecdote that illustrates just how much power his opinion held. The Duke of Bedford, a genuine aristocrat with one of the most prestigious titles in England, once asked Brummel what he thought of his new coat. Brummel examined it with his characteristic cool impertinence, taking the lapel between his fingers, turning the Duke around, scrutinising every seam and stitch. Then he said in a tone of pitying wonder, "Bedford, do you call this thing a coat?" The Duke of Bedford, one of the richest and most powerful men in England, was mortified. The coat was never worn again. That's power. Real power. Not the power of birth or title or wealth, though those things certainly helped, but the power of absolute conviction in your own taste. Brummel believed completely and utterly that he knew what looked right, and he convinced everyone else to believe it too. But there's a shadow creeping into this story, one we'll explore more fully later. All of this, the 5-hour rituals, the dozens of discarded cravats, the multiple tailors, the champagne-polished boots, cost money, vast amounts of money. More money than Brummel actually had. He was living on his inheritance from his father, and he was spending it faster than a responsible person would. He was also gambling, another expensive habit of fashionable men. The debts were accumulating. But for now, in 1805, Brummel is at the height of his influence, spending 5 hours each morning creating perfection and changing how every man in the Western world thought about getting dressed. Take a moment and think about your own morning routine. How long does it take you to get ready? 10 minutes? 20? Maybe 30 if you're really taking your time? Now multiply that by 10. That's what Brummel did every single day. And the strange thing is, I almost admire it. Not because I'd want to spend 5 hours getting dressed. I definitely wouldn't. But because there's something weirdly inspiring about that level of commitment to a craft. Even if the craft is just looking good. He cared. He cared so deeply about every detail, every element of his appearance. In our age of sweatpants and sneakers, there's something almost moving about someone caring that much about how they presented themselves to the world. But we're not done with the absurdity of men's fashion yet, not even close. Because while Brummel was spending 5 hours creating perfection, other men were struggling with one particular item that would become the bane of every gentleman's existence, the source of endless frustration and somehow the absolute centre of male fashion. I'm talking about the cravat, of course. And you thought you'd heard enough about neckties. Oh, my friend, we're just getting started. The story of the cravat deserves its own telling, and it's somehow even more complicated than what we've just explored. So let's keep moving forward, deeper into this world of starched linen and knotted frustration, where grown men spent hours trying to tie a piece of fabric around their necks and called it elegance. There's something darkly comical about the cravat, when you really think about it. Here we have a simple piece of fabric, just a length of linen, usually white, nothing inherently complicated about it. And yet this innocent strip of cloth became the single most frustrating, most time-consuming, most anxiety-inducing element of a gentleman's wardrobe. Men obsessed over it. They wrote entire books about it. They spent hours each morning wrestling with it. Some reportedly wept in frustration when they couldn't get it right. And here's what makes it even more absurd. The entire point was to make it look like you hadn't tried at all. The perfect cravat was meant to appear casually elegant, effortlessly draped, as natural as breathing. Achieving that look of effortlessness, that could take all morning. Let me take you back to September 1818, when something extraordinary was published in London. It was a small volume satirical in nature, with a ridiculously pompous title, Neckclothetania. The full subtitle went on for several lines, promising to reveal the secrets of tying various styles of cravats. The author claimed to be documenting the fashions of the day, but really he was gently mocking the sheer obsession men had developed for their neckcloths. And yet, despite the satire, the book became genuinely useful. Why? Because it actually did document different cravat styles, 32 of them to be exact. 32 different ways to tie a piece of fabric around your neck. Think about that for a moment. 32 styles, not just tied or untied, not just loose or tight. 32 distinct named styles, each with its own technique, its own aesthetic, its own social implications. There was the mathematical, the oriental, the ballroom, the American, the Osbaldeston, the Napoleon, the Trône d'Amour, each one different, each one requiring specific skills to execute properly. Some of these styles were considered appropriate for morning wear, others for evening. Some were fashionable for young men, others for older gentlemen. The cravat had become a language unto itself, and you had to be fluent to navigate polite society. But wait, it gets better. A decade later, in 1828, another book appeared. This one wasn't satirical at all. It was deadly serious. The title was The Art of Tying the Cravat, and it presented itself as an instructional manual, complete with detailed descriptions and illustrations. The authors' names are wonderfully telling. They listed themselves as Baron Émile de Lempessé, Comte de la Salde and H. Leblanc. Now, if you speak French, you might catch the joke here. Baron de Lampsay translates roughly to Baron Starch. Comte de la Salde means Count Starched, and H. Leblanc, Mr. White. The authors were literally calling themselves Baron Starch, Count Starched, and Mr. White. They were poking fun at the whole enterprise even as they contributed to it. The book was both genuine instructional manual and elaborate inside joke. And you know what's amazing? People bought it. They studied it. They took it seriously even while appreciating the humour. Because as ridiculous as it all seems, men genuinely needed help with their cravats. The thing was genuinely difficult to master. So what made the cravat so challenging? Let's start with the material. The ideal cravat was made of fine white linen, woven smooth and tight. Already we're talking about an expensive material. Fine linen wasn't cheap, but the linen was just the beginning. Before wearing, the cravat had to be starched. And I don't mean lightly spritzed with spray starch like we might do today. I mean thoroughly, completely, aggressively starched, until it was stiff enough to stand on its own. The starch of choice was usually rice starch, though potato starch was also popular. The process of starching involved mixing the starch powder with water to create a paste, boiling it, letting it cool slightly, and then dipping the linen into this mixture. The fabric had to be worked through the starch, ensuring even coverage. Then it had to be wrung out carefully, not so much that you removed all the starch, but enough that it wasn't dripping. After that came drying, which took time, and then, once dry, the cravat had to be ironed while still slightly damp to achieve the perfect level of crispness. Getting the starch just right was an art in itself. Too little starch and the cravat would be limp, unable to hold its shape, the folds collapsing as soon as you tied them. Too much starch and it would be brittle, cracking at the creases, impossible to tie without it breaking apart. You needed that perfect middle ground, stiff enough to hold a shape, flexible enough to be manipulated. Valets and laundresses developed their own secret recipes, their own techniques for achieving the ideal consistency. Some added a bit of blue dye to the starch to make the white appear even whiter. Others had special methods for applying the starch that created a smoother finish. Now, imagine you're standing before your mirror on a typical morning ready to tie your cravat. The starched linen is laid out before you, crisp and white, looking deceptively simple. You pick it up. Immediately you feel the resistance. This isn't soft fabric that drapes naturally. It's almost like working with paper or thin cardboard. It has a will of its own. The basic process goes something like this. You position the center of the cravat at the front of your neck, the two ends hanging down on either side. Then you bring the ends around to the back, crossing them. So far, so good. But now comes the tricky part. You have to bring the ends back around to the front. And as you do, you need to start creating the aesthetic you're aiming for. Is this a simple knot or a complex bow? Are you folding the fabric or letting it lie flat? How much tension are you applying? Too loose and it looks sloppy, too tight and you'll strangle yourself, not metaphorically, literally. Men sometimes fainted from overly tight cravats cutting off blood flow to the brain. Let's say you're attempting what was called the mathematical, one of the simpler styles, named for its geometric precision. You've brought the ends around to the front, and now you need to cross them in an exact X shape, maintaining equal tension on both sides. The starched linen fights you. It wants to spring back, to crease in the wrong places. Your fingers, trying to hold everything in position while also manipulating the fabric, start to cramp. You tie the knot, trying to center it perfectly under your chin. You step back to look in the mirror. Look. The left side is higher than the right. There's a wrinkle forming near your collarbone. The knot itself is slightly off-center. It's not right. So you untie it, start again. This time you'll maintain more tension on the left side to compensate. You wrap it around, bring the ends forward, cross them, tie the knot. Better. But now there's a tiny pleat in the fabric that shouldn't be there, and when you turn your head slightly to check the side view, you can see the back isn't lying flat. The collar of your shirt is peeking out unevenly, not right. Untie, try again, and again, and again, and again. Can you feel the frustration building? Your valet is standing by with a growing pile of fresh cravats over his arm, saying nothing, but you can sense his impatience. You're on your 6th attempt now, or is it your 7th? You're starting to lose count. The discarded cravats are piling up on the floor, each one a failure, each one mocking you with its crumpled imperfection. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. Brummel, as we discussed, might go through a dozen cravats on a typical morning, 30 on a difficult day. But it wasn't just Brummel. Fashionable men everywhere were going through this ritual torture. The novelist Edward Bulwer-Lytton described a dandy of his acquaintance who would emerge from his dressing room after hours of struggle, his face red and sweating, his temper frayed, but his cravat absolutely perfect. The cravat was pristine. The man was exhausted. Here's a detail that really brings this home. There were actual medical consequences to wearing these heavily starched, tightly tied cravats. Doctors of the era documented cases of what they called cravat paralysis, a temporary weakness in the hands and arms caused by the tight collar pressing on nerves in the neck. Men developed chronic neck pain, headaches and digestive issues from the constant pressure. The high, stiff collars and tight cravats didn't allow for much movement of the head. You couldn't easily look down to read, or up to see something tall. You had to move your entire upper body. It was literally restrictive. And yet, despite all of this, the cravat was non-negotiable. A gentleman did not appear in public without one. It would be like going out today without pants. Technically possible, but socially catastrophic. The cravat was the mark of a civilized man. Without it, you were essentially naked, regardless of how many other clothes you might be wearing. The social pressure around cravats was intense. There are stories of young men being refused entry to social events because their cravats weren't tied properly, of gentlemen being mocked mercilessly for appearing with a wrinkled or poorly knotted cravat. Your cravat was scrutinized by everyone you met. People would literally judge your worth as a person based on how well you'd tied a piece of fabric around your neck that morning. Does that seem insane? It was insane, and yet it was reality. The height of the collar made things even more challenging. We touched on this briefly before, but let's really dive into it now. The shirt collars of this era weren't the soft, fold-over collars we're familiar with today. They were high, standing collars starched just as stiffly as the cravat itself. These collars were called points because they had pointed ends that jutted up along the sides of the face. In the early 1800s, some men wore points that came up to their cheekbones. Others, the real extremists, wore points that reached nearly to their earlobes. Yes, you heard that correctly. Earlobes. Imagine trying to turn your head when you have stiff fabric points pressing against your jaw and cheeks. You couldn't. Men had to turn their entire bodies if they wanted to look to the side. The cartoonists of the era had a field day with this. There are satirical prints showing dandies with collars so high they can't see where they're walking, bumping into lampposts and falling into puddles because they physically cannot look down. These exaggerated collars were actually a source of some danger. There's a recorded incident, and I'm not making this up, of a man who fell down a flight of stairs because he couldn't see his feet over his collar. Another gentleman reportedly stabbed himself in the eye with his own collar point when he turned his head too quickly. These collars were weapons, accidental, fashionable weapons. The collars and cravats worked together, you see. The collar provided the foundation, the structure. The cravat then wrapped around and over this collar, creating a unified column of starched white linen that framed the face. The contrast between the white linen and a dark coat was considered extremely attractive, It drew the eye to the face, created a sense of classical proportion. People at the time often reference Grecian columns when describing the aesthetic. Your neck, wrapped in all this starched linen, was meant to evoke the elegant pillars of ancient temples. Your head rested atop this column like a work of classical sculpture. It sounds ridiculous when described that way, doesn't it? But that's genuinely what they were going for. The neoclassical aesthetic that dominated this period wasn't just about architecture and art, it extended to the human body. You were meant to be a living sculpture, your clothing the marble from which you were carved. Now, you might be wondering, with all these difficulties, why didn't someone invent an easier solution? They did, actually. Enter the stock. The stock was essentially a pre-made cravat, a stiffened band that buckled or fastened at the back of the neck. You didn't have to tie it, you just put it on like a collar. The stock was particularly popular with military officers who needed to dress quickly and couldn't afford to spend an hour fussing with a cravat. But here's the thing, in fashionable civilian circles, wearing a stock was considered, well, cheating. It was seen as lazy, as cutting corners. A real gentleman tied his own cravat fresh every morning. The stock was acceptable for soldiers, for practical men engaged in active pursuits. But for a dandy, for a man of fashion, unthinkable. You might as well announce to the world that you couldn't be bothered to put in the effort required for true elegance. This brings us back to an idea we touched on earlier, the concept of studied carelessness, or sprezzatura, to use the Italian term that was sometimes applied. The goal was to look like you hadn't tried, like your perfect appearance was simply natural to you. But everyone knew it wasn't natural. Everyone knew about the hours of effort, the dozens of discarded cravats, the careful starching and tying and adjusting. The trick was to hide all that effort, to make the end result look effortless. And paradoxically, the more effort you concealed, the more impressive your achievement was considered to be. It's exhausting just thinking about it, isn't it? The mental gymnastics involved in trying to look like you're not trying. The hours spent perfecting something meant to appear unperfected. There's something very human about it, though. How many of us today put effort into appearing effortless? We carefully compose social media posts to seem spontaneous. We rehearse conversations to sound natural. We work out to look like we're just naturally fit. The specific details have changed, but the impulse, the desire to seem naturally superior, to hide the work that goes into our presentation, that's timeless, but I think there's a difference in degree here. The cravat obsession represents something extreme, something that goes beyond normal vanity into the realm of the absurd. And the men of the time knew it was absurd. The satirical publications, the jokes, the cartoons, they all indicate that people were aware of how ridiculous this had become. Yet they kept doing it. They kept spending hours on their cravats. They kept going through dozens of attempts. Why? Because the alternative, appearing in public with a poorly tied cravat, was socially unthinkable. The tyranny of fashion is that once a standard is established, you can't simply opt out without consequences. There's a poem from the era that captures this beautifully. I wish I could tell you who wrote it, but it circulated anonymously as many satirical verses did. It went something like this. My neckcloth, of course, forms my principal care, for by that we criterions of elegance swear, and it costs me each morning some hours of flurry to make it appear to be tied in a hurry. Hours of flurry to appear hurried. That's the cravat in a nutshell. Before we move on, I want you to take a moment to appreciate something. Next time you get dressed, notice how you put on your shirt, how you might straighten your collar or adjust your tie if you wear one. It takes, 30 seconds? Maybe a minute if you're being particular? Now multiply that by 100. That's the cravat. That's what these men went through every single morning, and they did it knowing that a slight breeze, a quick movement, even the simple act of eating lunch might disturb the carefully achieved perfection, requiring adjustment or even complete retying. Living with a cravat meant living carefully. You couldn't laugh too hard, it might dislodge the folds. You couldn't eat soup without extreme caution. A splash could stain the white linen. You couldn't engage in any physical activity whatsoever. The cravat demanded stillness, composure, control. It shaped not just how you looked, but how you moved through the world, how you held your body, how you interacted with your environment. It was, in a very real sense, a straitjacket of fashion. A voluntary straitjacket, yes, but a straitjacket nonetheless. And yet I find myself oddly moved by it all. There's something almost touching about the care these men took, the importance they placed on getting this small detail exactly right. In our current era of casual everything, where people wear pajamas to the grocery store and sweatpants to restaurants, there's something almost noble about caring so deeply about appearance. Misguided, perhaps, excessive, certainly, but noble in its own strange way. The cravat would eventually evolve, of course. It would become the bow tie, the necktie, the modern accessories we wear today with relatively little fuss. But we'll get to that evolution later. For now, we need to understand something else, something bigger than the cravat itself. Because while men were wrestling with their neckcloths, something profound was happening in society. A revolution, really, though not one fought with weapons. This was a revolution in colour, in ornamentation, in the very idea of what it meant to be a man. Historians call it the Great Male Renunciation, and it changed everything. It's time we explore how men went from peacocks to pigeons, from silken colour to wool and black, and how this transformation was about so much more than just fashion. So breathe easy, relax your shoulders, imagine you're untying that too tight cravat, and let's continue into this story of how men lost their colours. Something extraordinary happened between 1780 and 1840, something so profound that we're still living with its consequences today. If you look at portraits of wealthy men from 1750, you'll see them draped in silk the colour of robins' eggs, emeralds, roses, butterflies. Their coats shimmer with gold and silver embroidery. They wear pink satin breeches and powder blue waistcoats. They look, quite frankly, magnificent. Fast forward just 50 years, and suddenly all those colours have vanished. The men are wearing black, dark blue, charcoal grey. The embroidery is gone, the silk has been replaced with wool, the peacocks have become crows. What happened? Why did men collectively decide to abandon beauty? This transformation has a name given to it by a British psychologist named John Carl Flugel in 1930. He called it the Great Male Renunciation, and it's one of the most fascinating turning points in the history of human appearance. But let's start with what men looked like before they renounced all that glory. Close your eyes for a moment and really try to picture this. It's 1760, and you're standing in the gardens of Versailles. All around you are men in coats of rose-pink silk with silver embroidery depicting roses and leaves climbing up the front panels. A gentleman passes by in a suit of pale lilac, the waistcoat embroidered with tiny pearls forming the shape of butterflies. Another wears emerald green velvet with gold thread creating elaborate scrollwork across the chest and sleeves. These aren't costumes. This isn't theatre. This is everyday fashion for aristocratic men. The colour palette available to men in the mid-1700s was staggering. Dyers had mastered the art of creating vivid, stable colours from natural sources. Madder root gave you brilliant reds. Indigo produced deep blues. Cochineal insects, crushed by the thousands, created the most exquisite crimsons. Saffron made yellows. Woad created sky blues. And these weren't flat single tones. Fabrics could be dyed multiple times to create complex, layered colours. A silk might be dyed first with blue, then overdyed with yellow to create a particular shade of green that couldn't be achieved any other way. The effect in sunlight was extraordinary. These colours had depth, richness, a kind of luminous quality that modern synthetic dyes, for all their advantages, struggle to replicate. And the variety. You could wear a different colour every day for months and never repeat yourself. Primrose yellow waistcoats, coral pink breeches, sky blue coats, plum purple jackets, mint green vests. Some men coordinated their colours carefully, creating harmonious ensembles. Others deliberately clashed, wearing combinations that seemed designed to assault the eye. A purple coat with orange breeches and a yellow waistcoat. It sounds garish, doesn't it? But somehow in that world of candlelight and powder and wigs it worked, or at least people thought it worked. Here's what's important to understand. In the 1700s, there was no expectation that men should dress more soberly than women. If anything, men's clothing was often more elaborate. We talked about this briefly in our first section, but it bears repeating because it's so contrary to our modern assumptions. When we think of historical gender differences in dress, we imagine women in elaborate gowns and men in simple suits. But for most of human history, that wasn't true at all. Rich men dressed as elaborately as rich women, sometimes more so. The idea that men should be plain and women should be decorative, that's a recent invention. Very recent. So what changed? The answer is complex, woven from threads of politics, philosophy, economics, and pure accident of timing. Let's start with the politics. The late 1700s were revolutionary years, literally. 1776, the American Revolution begins. 1789, the French Revolution erupts. These weren't just political upheavals, they were ideological earthquakes that shook the foundations of how people thought about society, hierarchy, and human worth. The Enlightenment philosophers had been laying groundwork for decades. Rousseau, Locke, Voltaire, these thinkers were questioning the very basis of aristocratic privilege. Why should some people be born to wealth and power while others toiled in poverty? What justified the vast gulf between the silk-clad nobleman and the wool-wearing worker? The old answer, God ordained it. It's the natural order, it's always been this way, was starting to sound hollow. A new idea was taking hold. Perhaps all men were created equal. Perhaps human worth didn't come from birth, but from character, ability, work. And if all men were equal, or should be, then how should they dress? The elaborate, expensive costumes of the aristocracy suddenly seemed not just frivolous, but actively offensive. They were visible proof of inequality, walking advertisements for unjust privilege. A man in a gold-embroidered coat was announcing to the world, "I don't need to work. I have so much wealth that I can wear a year's wages on my back. I am fundamentally different from you." That message was becoming dangerous. There's a wonderful, or perhaps terrible, depending on your perspective, moment during the French Revolution that illustrates this perfectly. In 1792, the revolutionary government issued a decree stating that citizens should no longer wear knee breeches, silk stockings, and buckled shoes, the traditional markers of aristocratic dress. Instead, they should wear long trousers, the garment of workers and sailors. The revolutionaries even had a name for themselves based on this, the sans-culottes, meaning without breeches. They were defining themselves in opposition to the aristocratic costume. Your clothing became a political statement. Wear breeches and silk and you were marking yourself as an enemy of the revolution. That could get you killed, literally. People went to the guillotine partly because of what they wore. Now, England didn't have a violent revolution like France, but the ideas were spreading. British aristocrats watched France nervously, aware that the same forces could erupt in their own country. There was a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, it was prudent to tone things down a bit, to not flaunt wealth quite so obviously, to dress in a way that suggested you were a serious person, a productive person, not just a decorative ornament living off inherited wealth. And here's where the economics come in. Britain was industrializing, factories were being built, middle-class merchants and manufacturers were accumulating wealth, sometimes surpassing the old landed aristocracy. These new wealthy men wanted to distinguish themselves from the idle aristocrats. They wanted to show that they had earned their money through work, through industry, through merit. And how do you visually communicate that you're a serious businessman rather than a frivolous courtier? You dress simply, practically. You wear dark colours that don't show dirt. You choose durable wool over delicate silk. Your clothes say, "I am a man of business, a man of substance, not a butterfly flitting from party to party." The English countryside played a role too. There's something called code or country house style that emerged in the late 1700s. Aristocratic men, when at their country estates, had always dressed more casually than they did at court. Wool coats for riding and hunting, practical boots, simpler cuts that allowed for movement. This country style started to influence city fashion. The frock coat, originally riding wear, became acceptable for urban life. Dark colours that wouldn't show the dirt of country pursuits became fashionable everywhere. The aesthetic of the English country gentleman, practical and understated, began to supplant the elaborate courtier. And then there's Brummel again. We've talked about how he complicated getting dressed, but here's the other side of his influence. He simplified the appearance. Brummel didn't wear embroidery. He didn't wear bright colours. His signature look was a dark blue coat, almost navy, with buff-coloured or pale grey breeches or pantaloons and a white waistcoat. That's it. 3 colours, dark blue, creamorse grey, and white. Compare that to the rainbow of colours available just a generation earlier. Brummel was stripping men's fashion down to its essentials, but here's the genius of what he did and why it worked. He made simplicity luxurious. The lack of ornamentation meant that every eye went to the quality of the materials and the perfection of the cut. You couldn't hide behind embroidery anymore. The cloth itself had to be superb, the finest wool woven so smoothly it almost shimmered. The tailoring had to be impeccable, every seam perfect, every line clean. In a way, this was more demanding than the old style. Any mediocre tailor could cover a badly cut coat with enough embroidery to distract the eye. But a plain dark coat? That showed every flaw. You had to be really good to make it work. There's a quote attributed to Brummel that captures his philosophy. To be truly elegant, one should not be noticed. Think about that. Not be noticed. The entire goal of getting dressed after spending 5 hours on it was to not be noticed. Or rather, to be noticed for your overall appearance, your presence, your bearing, but not for any specific flashy element of your clothing. The clothes should be so perfect that they disappear, leaving only the man visible. It's a deeply strange idea when you examine it, but it became the foundation of modern menswear. By the 1820s, the transformation was largely complete. Dark colours had won. Wool had replaced silk for day wear. Embroidery had vanished except on the most formal court dress. The rainbow had faded to a grayscale. Men still cared about fashion, sometimes obsessively as we've seen, but they cared about subtleties now. The exact shade of grey, the precise width of a lapel, the perfect drape of a trouser. To the untrained eye, all gentlemen looked roughly the same, but to those in the know, the differences were everything. John Flugel, writing about this transformation in 1930, used wonderfully dramatic language. He said that men had abandoned their claim to be considered beautiful and henceforth aimed at being only useful. That's perhaps overstating it. Men certainly didn't stop caring about appearance, but there's truth in his assessment. Something fundamental had shifted. Beauty, ornamentation, visual pleasure, these were now designated as feminine concerns. Men were supposed to be practical, functional, serious. Their clothing should reflect that. And here's what's remarkable. This wasn't just a fashion change. It was a psychological shift. Flugel argued that the great male renunciation represented men collectively deciding that their bodies, their physical appearance, shouldn't be sources of pleasure or aesthetic interest. That kind of vanity was unmanly. A real man focused on achievement, on work, on building and doing. His appearance was secondary at best, frivolous at worst. Women could be decorative, that was their role. But men should be plain. Think about the long-term consequences of this. We're living with them right now. Walk down any street today and look at what people are wearing. The women will likely display a huge variety of colours, patterns, styles. The men? Mostly variants of the same uniform. Dark pants, simple shirt, maybe a jacket. We've inherited this idea that men shouldn't be too interested in their appearance, that caring too much about fashion is somehow feminine. That's the great male renunciation still echoing through time. But wait, didn't we just spend 3 sections talking about how obsessed men were with fashion? How they spent hours tying cravats and getting dressed? Isn't that a contradiction? Here's the thing, they were obsessed with getting it right. But right now meant looking like they hadn't tried. The complexity was hidden. The effort was concealed. You could spend 5 hours on your appearance, but the result had to look effortless, natural, simple. That's the great irony of the great male renunciation. Men didn't stop caring about fashion. They just pretended they didn't care. And that pretense required more work than ever. There were holdouts, of course. Older men who had grown up in the colourful era sometimes clung to their embroidered waistcoats and coloured coats. At court functions, traditional dress was still required. You couldn't appear before the king in a plain wool suit. But these were increasingly seen as exceptions, special circumstances. For ordinary life, even for relatively formal occasions, dark and simple was the new standard. Let me paint you a picture of the contrast. Imagine a portrait painted in 1760. The subject is a wealthy merchant. He's wearing a coat of russet silk with silver buttons, a waistcoat embroidered with pastoral scenes in coloured threads, pale blue breeches, white silk stockings, and shoes with large silver buckles. His wig is powdered white and flows over his shoulders. He looks prosperous, certainly, but also somewhat, dare I say it, ridiculous to modern eyes. There's almost something costume party about it. Now imagine a portrait from 1830. Same level of wealth, same social class. But this man wears a dark blue coat so deep it's almost black. A cream-coloured waistcoat, very plain. Dark trousers, no more breeches and stockings. A white cravat at his neck, his own hair unpowdered, cut short. He looks like he could walk into a modern office and not seem too out of place. You could put a modern necktie on him and he'd fit right in. That's how foundational this change was. We're still wearing, essentially, the outfit that emerged from the great male renunciation. There's something profoundly sad about it, when you think about it. Half of humanity collectively decided, or had decided for them, that they shouldn't be beautiful. That visual pleasure, decorative interest, colour, and pattern and texture, these weren't for them. I'm not saying the old system was better. The old system was built on appalling inequality, on people spending a year's wages on a single coat while others starved. But couldn't we have kept the beauty while ditching the inequality? Couldn't we have found a way for everyone to wear colours, not no one? John Flugel thought so. Writing in the 1930s, he argued that the great male renunciation was a kind of psychological trauma from which men had never recovered. He believed men secretly mourned their lost peacock plumage, and that this loss had created a kind of narcissistic wound in the male psyche. He even suggested that many modern neuroses among men stemmed from this repression of the desire to be beautiful. Whether he was right about that, I couldn't say, but it's an interesting idea, isn't it? That some part of the male soul still longs for rose-pink silk and gold embroidery, but society has deemed it forever off limits. And yet, every now and then you see glimmers of rebellion. The 1960s and 70s saw men experiment with colour again. Think of the Peacock Revolution, men in colourful shirts and bell-bottoms. Punk brought back decorative elements, chains and studs and wild colours. Hip-hop fashion introduced pattern and brightness. More recently, people like Billy Porter have been pushing back against the tyranny of the dark suit, wearing gowns and elaborate outfits and looking absolutely magnificent doing it. Maybe, just maybe, we're starting to question whether the great male renunciation was such a good idea after all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still in the 1800s, and the renunciation is in full force. Men have given up their colours, their embroidery, their silk and satin. They're wearing dark wool suits and spending their decorative energy on tiny details. The knot of a cravat, the shine of a boot, the fit of a trouser. And speaking of trousers, we need to talk about them. Because while men were giving up colour, they were also wrestling with a new garment that brought its own complications, its own rules, its own absurdities. The transition from breeches to trousers wasn't just a style change. It was a social revolution with its own bizarre customs and expectations, and the story of how men's legs went from being display pieces to being hidden away, that's worth exploring in depth. So take a breath, let these ideas about colour and renunciation settle in your mind, and let's move forward to examine how the most fundamental garment of male fashion, the thing that covers a man's legs, became a new kind of obsession, a new source of both pride and anxiety. Let's talk about legs. I know that might sound like an odd topic, but bear with me because for hundreds of years, a gentleman's legs were one of his most important assets. Not for walking, though that helped, but for display. In the 1700s and 1800s, a well-shaped calf was considered as attractive on a man as a beautiful face, maybe more so. Fashion was specifically designed to show off the male leg, to draw attention to its shape, its musculature, its form. And the garments created to achieve this, breeches, stockings, and yes, high-heeled shoes, were marvels of engineering and sources of endless complication. This is the story of how men's legs went from being centre stage to being hidden away, and what that transformation reveals about changing ideas of masculinity, class, and power. First, let me explain what breeches actually were, because the word has fallen out of common use, and many people today aren't quite sure what we're talking about. Breeches were trousers, essentially, but they stopped at the knee. They fit tightly over the thigh, and I mean tightly, leaving very little to the imagination. And then they fastened at the knee with buttons, buckles, or ties. Below the knee, you wore nothing but stockings. Your entire lower leg, from knee to ankle, was covered only by a thin layer of knitted or woven fabric. Everything was on display. Now, imagine for a moment that you're a fashionable gentleman in 1750. You're preparing for an important social event, perhaps a ball or a formal dinner. Your servant helps you into your breeches. These aren't made of stretchy material like modern exercise wear. They're cut from leather, often buckskin, which is deer leather, or from fine wool, or occasionally from silk for very formal occasions. The material doesn't give, so getting them on requires a process. You start by sitting down. Your servant, and you definitely need help with this, begins working the breeches up your legs. The leather or fabric is cut so precisely to the shape of your leg that it takes real effort to pull them into place. Your servant has to use both hands, pulling and smoothing, working the material up inch by inch. Your thighs are essentially being shrink-wrapped. Once the breeches are finally up, they fasten at the waist with buttons and a waistband. But here's where it gets interesting, the front closure. For most of the 1700s and into the early 1800s, breeches had what was called a full front. Instead of a fly with buttons running vertically, the entire front panel would fall down. You had buttons at the sides of the waistband, and when you unbuttoned them, the front would drop forward, held only at the bottom. This meant that putting breeches on or taking them off required unbuttoning at the waist, and when nature called, you had to deal with this somewhat complicated system. Privacy wasn't really a concept in aristocratic households. Servants saw everything, but still, it was cumbersome. Below the waist, the breeches clung to your thighs like a second skin. The goal was to reveal the shape of your leg, to show off your musculature. A man with strong, well-formed thighs was considered very attractive. Riding, fencing, dancing, these activities built the kind of leg that looked good in breeches. Wealthy men sometimes actually hired fencing masters not primarily to learn to fight, but to develop their leg muscles. The lunge, the advance, the retreat, all these moves worked the thighs and calves in ways that translated to better appearance in breeches. And here's something that might surprise you. Some men who weren't naturally blessed with shapely leg would pad them. Yes, padding. They'd wear false calves, essentially prosthetics made of cotton or wool batting, shaped to look like muscle, tucked into their stockings to create the illusion of a more athletic leg. This wasn't considered cheating exactly, though it was definitely mocked if discovered. There are satirical prints from the era showing vain men with their false calves falling down around their ankles. But the fact that such products existed tells you how important leg shape was considered to be. The breeches fastened at the knee with ribbons, buckles or buttons. Getting this fastening right was crucial. Too loose and the breeches would slip down, bunching unfashionably. Too tight and you'd cut off circulation, your leg would go numb, which made dancing rather difficult. The fastening also had to be positioned precisely. Slightly too high or too low would throw off the entire silhouette. Your servant would spend several minutes adjusting the knee fastenings, making sure each leg was identical, that the fabric lay smooth and unwrinkled. Now we come to the stockings. These weren't like modern socks that you casually pull on. Stockings in the 17 and 1800s were works of art, especially if you were wealthy. The finest stockings were made of silk, knitted so finely that they were almost transparent. Pure white was the ideal colour, though you could also wear pale colours, cream, light grey, even occasionally pale pink or blue for the very daring. The stockings had to be pulled up over the knee, covering the bottom of the breeches, and held in place with garters tied just above or below the knee. Here's what made white silk stockings such a status symbol. They were impossible to keep clean. Silk stains easily. White shows every speck of dirt. If you wore white silk stockings, you were announcing to the world that you had servants to launder them constantly, that you had money to replace them frequently, that you didn't have to worry about dirt because you never did anything dirty. A labourer couldn't wear white silk stockings. They'd be ruined in an hour. But a gentleman, he could go through multiple pairs in a single day, changing them after every event, every activity. The whiteness of your stockings was a measure of your wealth and status. The process of putting on stockings was surprisingly complex. First, your legs had to be perfectly clean. Any dirt would show through the thin silk. Then the stockings had to be pulled up carefully to avoid snagging the delicate fabric on rough skin or toenails. Once on, they had to be smoothed absolutely flat. Any wrinkle, any crease, any gathering of fabric would be visible and considered terribly unfashionable. Achieving perfectly smooth stockings required patience and skill. Your servant would kneel before you, running his hands up and down your legs, smoothing out every tiny imperfection in the fabric. The garters that held the stockings up were another opportunity for display. Wealthy men wore decorative garters, silk ribbons, sometimes embroidered, tied in elaborate bows. When you crossed your legs while sitting, these garters would be visible, peeking out from beneath the hem of your breeches. They were, in essence, jewellery for your knees. Some men changed their garters to match their outfits, blue ribbons with a blue coat, cream ribbons with a cream waistcoat. The coordination could become quite elaborate. And then we get to the shoes. This is where things get really fascinating, because for much of the 1700s, fashionable men wore heels. Not small, discreet heels. Substantial heels, sometimes 2 or 3 inches high, occasionally even higher. Where did this fashion come from? It originated with Persian cavalry. Heels helped riders keep their feet secure in stirrups. European men encountering this style through trade and travel thought the heels looked marvellous and adopted them. Never mind that most aristocratic men rarely rode horses. The heels became associated with aristocratic status, with martial prowess, with a kind of masculine elegance. These weren't like modern high heels designed for women. They were chunkier, sturdier, but they were definitely high. Walking in them required practice and skill. You couldn't stride naturally, you had to step carefully, placing your feet deliberately. This actually contributed to the aristocratic bearing that was so prized. A man in heeled shoes couldn't slouch, couldn't shuffle, couldn't move carelessly. The shoes enforced an upright posture, a measured gait, a certain formality of movement. You looked like someone important, partly because your shoes wouldn't allow you to look any other way. The shoes themselves were often made of the same expensive fabrics as the rest of the outfit. Silk shoes, velvet shoes, leather, dyed in bright colours. These weren't sturdy walking shoes meant to last for years. They were fashion items, expected to be replaced regularly. The toes were often quite pointed, another element borrowed from Eastern styles. And remember those enormous shoe buckles we mentioned earlier. These weren't just decorative, they were status symbols. A pair of silver buckles might cost as much as a servant's annual wages. Gold buckles set with gemstones could represent a small fortune. Men collected shoe buckles the way some people today collect watches or jewellery. Have you ever tried walking in shoes with heels? If you have, you know it changes everything about how you move. Your balance shifts. You can't move quickly. Stairs become treacherous. Running is virtually impossible. Now add to that tight breeches that restrict your leg movement, and silk stockings that could tear if you move too vigorously, and you start to understand how fashion literally shaped behaviour. Aristocratic men moved carefully, deliberately, gracefully, because their clothing gave them no other choice. But here's what's really striking. All of this, the tight breeches, the silk stockings, the heeled shoes, was specifically designed to sexualize the male leg. That sounds strange to modern ears, doesn't it? We don't think of men's legs as particularly sexual, but in the 17 and 1800s they absolutely were. A man's legs were considered one of his most attractive features. Women were expected to hide their legs under long skirts, but men displayed theirs. The tighter the breeches, the more revealing the stockings, the better. It was a complete reversal of modern gender norms around display and concealment. There's a wonderful detail that illustrates this. When men sat down, they would often arrange themselves to show off their legs to best advantage. They'd extend one leg forward or cross their legs in a particular way that displayed the calf to maximum effect. Portrait painters knew to pose their male subjects to show off their legs. Look at portraits from this era. You'll often see men with one leg extended or standing with their weight on one leg so the other is slightly bent, emphasizing the shape of the calf. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate display. The decline of the heeled shoe is interesting in itself. By the 1740s, heels were starting to go out of fashion. They became lower, chunkier, less pronounced. By the 1770s, flat or nearly flat shoes were becoming the norm for fashionable men. Why? Several reasons. The simpler, more practical aesthetic we discussed earlier was starting to take hold. English country style favoured boots over shoes, function over display, and there was also a growing sense that heeled shoes were somewhat effeminate. That word was starting to be used as an insult, marking a shift in how masculinity was conceived. But even without heels, the display of legs continued. Breeches and stockings remained the standard well into the early 1800s. The transition to long trousers, to pantaloons that covered the entire leg, was gradual and complicated. Long trousers had been the garment of sailors and labourers, practical men who needed freedom of movement and durability. Bringing them into fashionable dress required a shift in how they were perceived. This is where Brummel comes in again. Sorry, I know we keep coming back to him, but his influence really was that pervasive. Brummel favoured close-fitting pantaloons over breeches. These were essentially very tight trousers that went all the way to the ankle, where they either tucked into boots or were held taut by the stirrup straps we discussed earlier. They were made of buckskin or very fine wool, and they fit almost as tightly as breeches had. So the leg was still very much on display, but now the entire leg was covered rather than just the thigh. Getting into these pantaloons was even more difficult than getting into breeches, if you can imagine that. Some fashionable men literally had to lie down to put on their pantaloons, with servants pulling from both ends to work the tight fabric up their legs. There are accounts of men being sewn into their pantaloons in the morning and cut out of them at night. This sounds like exaggeration, but multiple sources mention it, so there's likely some truth to it. The pantaloons were cut so tightly that normal fastenings wouldn't work. The fabric had to be literally stitched while being worn. Why would anyone submit to this? Same reason as always, fashion. The tightly fitted pantaloon showed off the entire line of the leg from hip to ankle. It created a smooth elegance. It was considered the height of fashion, and because it was difficult and uncomfortable, it served as another class marker. A man who could afford to be sewn into his pants every morning was clearly not a labourer. He was someone whose life was sufficiently leisured that physical discomfort in the name of appearance was acceptable. The stockings worn with these pantaloons were even more important than with breeches, because now there was no knee fastening to hide the transition. The stocking had to be perfectly smooth all the way from the pantaloon hem to the shoe. Any bunching, any wrinkling would be visible as a bump or irregularity in the sleek line of the leg. Achieving this required stockings of the highest quality and servants skilled in fitting them. But fashions were changing. By the 1820s and 30s, longer, looser trousers were becoming acceptable. These were still fitted, still tailored to show the shape of the leg, but they weren't skin tight anymore, and crucially, they covered the leg completely. The days of the sexualized male leg, of the calf as erotic display, were ending. Men's legs were being hidden away, tucked into trousers and boots, removed from view. Why? The same forces we've been discussing. The practical businessman didn't have time to be sewn into his pants. The egalitarian ethos of the post-revolutionary era suggested that display and sexual appeal were inappropriate for serious men. And there was a growing association between leg display and effeminacy, that concept again. Real men increasingly were supposed to be modest, covered up, their bodies rendered functionally invisible beneath properly concealing clothing. It's worth sitting with this change for a moment. For centuries, men's legs had been considered attractive, worthy of display, a legitimate source of pride and aesthetic pleasure. And then, quite suddenly in historical terms, they weren't. They were supposed to be hidden, ignored, treated as purely functional appendages rather than objects of beauty. That's a significant shift in how masculinity was conceptualized. The male body was being desexualized, removed from the realm of aesthetic appreciation, and we're still living with that legacy. Imagine if men today dressed in a way that specifically highlighted and sexualized their legs. It would seem bizarre, wouldn't it? But only because we've inherited this idea from the early 1800s that male legs aren't supposed to be looked at that way. There's something lost in that transition, I think. Not that I'm advocating for a return to breeches and silk stockings. That would be impractical and probably uncomfortable for most of us. But the idea that half of humanity decided or had decided for them that their bodies shouldn't be sources of aesthetic pleasure, that seems like a loss. The world is arguably less beautiful when we've decided that male legs, male bodies, male appearance should be functional and nothing more. And yet the complications didn't end with the transition to trousers. If anything, they just changed form. Because while men's legs were being covered up, other elements of male fashion were becoming foci of obsession. We've talked about cravats, we've talked about coats, but we haven't fully explored another crucial element of the fashionable man's appearance, the waistcoat. And the waistcoat, my friends, deserves its own story. Because while coats were becoming simpler and trousers were becoming standard, the waistcoat remained a space for creativity, expression, and sometimes absolute absurdity. It was the one place where a man could still show some personality, some flair, some deviation from the increasingly rigid rules of male dress. So let's continue our journey through this world of complicated fashion by exploring the waistcoat, hundreds of them in fact, because as we'll discover, owning just one or two would mark you as hopelessly unfashionable. If you wanted to understand a man in the late 1700s, his personality, his interests, his political leanings, even his sense of humour, you didn't look at his face, you looked at his waistcoat. While everything else in men's fashion was becoming restrained and uniform, the waistcoat remained gloriously, defiantly individual. It was the one garment where a gentleman could still express himself, where rules could be bent, where creativity was not just permitted but expected. And the truly fashionable man, he didn't own just a few waistcoats, he owned dozens, sometimes hundreds. There's a quote I want to share with you, one that perfectly captures the waistcoat mania of this era. In 1787, a French noblewoman named Baroness d'Aubercurque visited a gentleman's dressing room and was absolutely astonished by what she saw. She wrote in her diary that it was absolutely trendy to own dozens, even hundreds of gilets if one wanted to be fashionable. Hundreds. Can you imagine owning hundreds of anything in your wardrobe today? But for the fashionable man of the late 18th century, this wasn't excess. It was necessity. Let me take you inside that dressing room, help you understand what made the waistcoat so special, so essential, so worthy of this level of obsession. The waistcoat, or vest as Americans often call it, or gilet in French, was worn between the shirt and the coat. It was visible at the front, filling the V-shaped opening created by the coat. This meant it was one of the most prominent elements of your outfit, right there at eye level when someone looked at you. In earlier decades, waistcoats had been long, extending well past the waist, sometimes almost to the knees. But by the 1780s and 90s they were shortening, becoming more what we'd recognise today, ending at or just below the natural waistline. What made waistcoats special was that they were the acceptable place for decoration. Remember, by this period coats were increasingly plain. Dark colours, simple cuts, minimal ornamentation. Breeches or trousers were similarly restrained. But the waistcoat? The waistcoat could be anything. Bright colours, intricate patterns, elaborate embroidery, everything that was being stripped away from the rest of men's fashion found refuge in the waistcoat. It became a canvas for self-expression in an increasingly uniform world. The variety was staggering. You could have waistcoats in every colour imaginable. Crimson silk embroidered with gold thread, pale blue satin with silver flowers, cream-coloured fabric covered in tiny hand-painted birds, deep purple velvet with brass buttons, striped waistcoats where each stripe was a different colour, checked patterns that hurt the eyes. Some waistcoats featured elaborate scenes, pastoral landscapes with shepherds and sheep, classical ruins with columns and temples, even maritime scenes with ships and waves. The embroidery was often done by professional embroiderers who specialised in this work, artists who could create incredibly detailed images with needle and thread. But here's what's fascinating. Waistcoats weren't just decorative, they were communicative. The images and patterns you chose said something about you. A waistcoat embroidered with books and quills marked you as a literary man, someone who valued learning. Hunting scenes announced your love of country pursuits. Classical motifs suggested you were cultured, educated in the Greek and Roman traditions. Musical instruments indicated artistic sensibility. Even the colours carried meaning. Certain shades were associated with political parties. Buff and blue in England, for instance, were Whig colours. Wearing those colours was a political statement. During the French Revolution, waistcoats became especially politically charged. There's a surviving waistcoat in museum collections that's absolutely extraordinary. It features a tricolour diamond pattern in red, white and blue, the colours of revolutionary France. But here's what makes it remarkable. It also has embroidered inscriptions. On the pockets are the words "L'habit ne fait pas le moine," which translates to "the habit does not make the monk," essentially meaning "don't judge by appearances," and "honi soit qui mal y pense," which is "shame on him who thinks evil of it," the motto of the English Order of the Garter. So this waistcoat is simultaneously declaring revolutionary sympathies and English monarchist connections. What was the wearer trying to say? Was he hedging his bets? Was he trying to be provocative? We can't know for certain, but what we do know is that he thought carefully about the messages his waistcoat was sending. The materials used for waistcoats were often expensive. Silk was common, especially for formal waistcoats. The silk might be plain or it might be brocaded, woven with raised patterns. Satin created a lustrous, reflective surface that caught light beautifully. Velvet was popular for winter waistcoats, providing both warmth and a rich texture. Some waistcoats featured embroidery done in chenille, a fuzzy silk thread that created a soft, almost three-dimensional effect. Others used metallic threads, real gold or silver wire wrapped around silk cores that glittered dramatically in candlelight. The buttons deserve consideration too. Unlike coat buttons, which were increasingly standardized, waistcoat buttons remained highly individual. They could be covered in the same fabric as the waistcoat, creating a unified look, or they could contrast dramatically, jet black buttons on a pale waistcoat, gilt buttons on dark fabric. Some buttons were works of art in themselves, miniature paintings under glass, or carved from semi-precious stones, or crafted from ivory with elaborate designs. A complete set of fine buttons could cost a significant sum. Men collected buttons the way some people today collect cufflinks or tie pins. The construction of a fine waistcoat was complex. The front panels, the visible part, were made of the expensive decorative fabric. But the back was usually plain, often just linen or cotton, because no one would see it under your coat anyway. This practical economizing was universal. Why waste expensive silk on a part that wouldn't be seen? The waistcoat typically had pockets, which were functional rather than decorative. These pockets were where a gentleman kept his watch, his snuff box, perhaps a small amount of money. The pocket openings had to be finished carefully so they wouldn't fray, and they were often reinforced to handle the weight of a heavy gold watch. Now, let's talk about the quantity. Why did fashionable men own so many waistcoats? Several reasons. First, waistcoats were more than just an underlayer. They were a crucial part of your ensemble, and they needed to coordinate with the rest of your outfit. If you wore a dark blue coat one day and a bottle green coat the next, you'd need different waistcoats to complement each. The wrong waistcoat with a particular coat looked discordant, amateurish. Second, waistcoats were seasonal. Heavy velvet or quilted waistcoats for winter, light silk or cotton for summer. You couldn't wear the same waistcoats year-round unless you wanted to be either sweltering or freezing. And within seasons you needed variety. Wearing the same waistcoat multiple times in a single week would be noticed and remarked upon. People paid attention. They remembered what you'd worn. Appearing in the same waistcoat too frequently suggested you didn't have others, that you were poor or worse, stingy. Third, waistcoats were occasion-specific. There were waistcoats for morning wear, for afternoon calls, for dinner, for balls, for the theatre. Each occasion had its own expectations. A waistcoat that was perfectly appropriate for a country outing would be completely wrong for a formal court appearance. Getting this wrong could be socially devastating. You'd be marked as someone who didn't understand the rules, who didn't belong. And fourth, and this might be the most important reason, changing your waistcoat was one of the few ways a man could introduce variety into his appearance. Remember, the coat was becoming increasingly standardized. Dark colors, simple cuts, breeches or trousers similarly restrained. If you wanted to look different from day to day, if you wanted to signal your individuality, the waistcoat was your primary tool. It was the one element that could transform your entire appearance without violating the increasingly rigid rules of masculine dress. So men accumulated waistcoats. Lots of them. The Baron d'Oberkirch mentioned hundreds, and while that might have been an exaggeration in some cases, we have estate inventories that list dozens. Wealthy men genuinely did own 30, 40, 50 waistcoats, each one unique, each one expensive, each one representing hours of skilled labour. The weaving of the silk, the embroidery of the design, the tailoring to fit perfectly. And fit was crucial. A waistcoat had to fit absolutely perfectly. Too tight and it would gap between the buttons, showing your shirt underneath, unthinkable. Too loose and it would look sloppy, ruining the clean line of your silhouette. The armholes had to be cut precisely so the waistcoat didn't bunch under your coat. The length had to be exact, long enough to meet your breeches or trousers without a gap, short enough not to create bulk at the hip. The shoulders had to sit flat. Every button had to align perfectly. This meant that when your body changed, as bodies do, your waistcoats might no longer fit. Gaining or losing even a small amount of weight could render an entire wardrobe of waistcoats unwearable. You'd have to have them altered or, if you were wealthy enough, simply commission new ones. There are accounts of men who'd gained weight trying to squeeze into waistcoats that no longer fit. The buttons straining, the fabric pulling, sometimes literally popping open at inopportune moments. The mortification was intense. The process of acquiring a fine waistcoat was elaborate. If you wanted something special, why would you want anything less? You'd visit a mercer, a dealer in fine fabrics. There you'd examine silks and velvets, feeling the weight and texture, considering how they'd look in candlelight, how they'd wear, how they'd complement your existing wardrobe. Once you'd chosen the fabric, you might commission embroidery. You'd discuss designs with an embroiderer, perhaps sketching what you wanted, or choosing from pattern books. The embroiderer would quote a price. Embroidery was expensive, charged by the hour, and a complex design could take weeks to complete. Once the fabric was embroidered, it would go to a tailor who specialised in waistcoats. Tailoring was becoming increasingly specialised in this era. You might have one tailor for coats, another for breeches, and yet another for waistcoats, each specialised in their particular garment, perfecting techniques specific to that item. The waistcoat tailor would take your measurements, create a pattern, cut the fabric, and construct the garment. This process took time, weeks, sometimes months if the embroidery was elaborate. And the cost? A single fine waistcoat could easily cost more than a labourer earned in several months. But here's what I find most interesting about the waistcoat phenomenon. It represents a kind of rebellion against the increasing uniformity of men's fashion. As everything else became standardised, dark coats, simple trousers, restrained colours, the waistcoat remained wild. It was a safety valve for all the decorative impulses that were being suppressed elsewhere. Men who'd grown up seeing their fathers and grandfathers in colourful, elaborate clothing weren't ready to give up all that visual interest. The waistcoat let them hold on to a piece of that older aesthetic while still conforming to the new expectations of masculine dress. There's something poignant about this when you think about it. These men were trying to navigate a changing world where the old rules about display and ornamentation were shifting, where new ideas about what it meant to be masculine were taking hold. The waistcoat was their compromise. It said, I understand the new rules. I'm wearing a dark coat and proper trousers, but look at my waistcoat. I'm still an individual. I still have taste, personality, the ability to appreciate beauty. Don't reduce me to just another dark suit in a crowd of dark suits. The heyday of the elaborate waistcoat was relatively brief. By the 1820s and 30s, even waistcoats were becoming more restrained. Plain colours, simple patterns, less embroidery. The same forces pushing toward uniformity in the rest of men's fashion eventually caught up with the waistcoat. By the Victorian era, a gentleman might own half a dozen waistcoats rather than dozens or hundreds. They'd be relatively plain, perhaps distinguished by different colours or subtle patterns, but nothing like the riot of decoration that characterised the late 1700s. And yet, the waistcoat remained important. It was still the one place where you could introduce a note of personality, a flash of colour or pattern in an otherwise uniform outfit. Even today, when three-piece suits have largely disappeared from everyday wear, there's something about a well-chosen waistcoat that elevates an outfit, that suggests attention to detail and appreciation for the finer points of dress. The modern vest is a pale shadow of its 1800 ancestor, but it carries forward that same idea. This is where you can show a bit of individuality. Before we move on, I want you to imagine something. Imagine opening your closet and seeing not just one or two vests, but dozens, each one different, each one representing choices you made about colour, pattern, message. Imagine the mental work involved in choosing which one to wear each day. It's not just what am I in the mood for, it's what am I trying to communicate. It's fashion as language, as complex and nuanced as the words you choose to speak. That's what the waistcoat was in its golden age, a vocabulary of self-expression in fabric and thread. But even as men were expressing themselves through their waistcoats, something else was happening on top of their heads. Something we've mentioned but haven't fully explored. Something so ubiquitous, so essential that going without it would have been unthinkable. I'm talking about wigs, and not just any wigs, powdered wigs, those enormous white clouds of hair that seem so strange to us now but were absolutely standard for over a century. The wig has its own bizarre story, its own complications, its own moment of dramatic decline, and understanding why men wore wigs, how they maintained them, and why they eventually abandoned them. That reveals yet another layer of this elaborate world of masculine fashion. So take a breath, adjust your imaginary waistcoat, and let's explore the world of powder, pomade, and the peculiar social pressures that convinced men to cover their heads with someone else's hair. Why would anyone willingly cover their head with someone else's hair, then dump powder all over it until they looked like they had aged 50 years overnight? It's such a bizarre custom when you step back and really think about it. And yet for over a century, from around 1660 to 1790, fashionable European men wouldn't dream of appearing in public without their wigs. These weren't subtle hair pieces designed to look natural. These were elaborate constructions that cascaded down over the shoulders, billowed out at the sides, piled high on top. Architectural achievements in hair and horsehair transformed into clouds of white powder. The wig wasn't just an accessory, it was armor, status symbol, hygiene solution, and fashion statement all rolled into one. And the story of how it rose to prominence and then suddenly collapsed, that's a tale worth telling. The origin story is almost embarrassingly simple. King Louis XIV of France was going bald. This was around 1680, and Louis was in his 40s, at the absolute height of his power. He was the Sun King, the centre of the European universe, the man who'd famously declared "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. But even the Sun King couldn't stop his hairline from receding, and this was a problem, because in an age when appearance was power, when every aspect of your physical presentation communicated your authority, being bald was awkward. It suggested age, decline, loss of vitality. So Louis did what powerful men throughout history have done when faced with a problem money can solve. He threw money at it. He commissioned elaborate wigs. Now, wigs themselves weren't new. People had worn hairpieces for centuries. What was new was the scale and style. Louis wanted big wigs, impressive wigs, wigs that made him look like he had the most luxuriant hair imaginable. His wig makers rose to the challenge, creating massive constructions that added several inches to his height and framed his face dramatically. And because Louis set fashion for all of Europe, when the Sun King did something, everyone else followed. Suddenly, every aristocratic man needed a wig too. What started as one man's solution to baldness became a continent-wide fashion phenomenon. Let me describe what these wigs actually looked like, because they varied considerably depending on the era and the occasion. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, wigs were enormous. We're talking about constructions that could be 2 feet tall, with curls cascading down past the shoulders, sometimes nearly to the waist. The hair would be arranged in elaborate patterns, rows of sausage curls, waves that swooped and swirled, sometimes even braided sections. The sheer volume of hair involved was staggering. A full court wig might contain hair from a dozen different people, supplemented with horsehair, goat hair, even human hair scavenged from less fortunate sources. The construction process was complex and skilled. Wig makers were true craftsmen, members of a specialized guild. They'd start with a foundation, a cap of silk or linen that fit over the wearer's head. Onto this foundation they'd sew individual bundles of hair, working row by row, creating the shape and volume desired. The hair had to be arranged so it would hold its curl, so it would move naturally, so it would stay in place despite the weight. A full wig could weigh several pounds. Imagine carrying that on your head all day. Your neck muscles would need to be strong. But here's where it gets interesting, the colour. Most of these wigs were made from brown or black human hair, but fashionable men wanted white or grey wigs. Why? Because white hair suggested wisdom, maturity, gravitas. It made a young man look distinguished, an old man look venerable, so the wigs had to be powdered. And we're not talking about a light dusting, we're talking about thorough, complete coating in white powder until not a single hair of the original colour showed through. The powder was usually made from starch, either wheat starch, rice starch or potato starch, depending on what was available and affordable. The starch would be ground into a fine powder, finer than flour. Sometimes it would be scented with lavender or other fragrances to make it more pleasant. Sometimes it would be tinted slightly. Blue-white was considered more fashionable than yellow-white, so a bit of blue dye might be added to the powder to achieve the desired shade. The powdering process was messy, to put it mildly. You couldn't just dust powder onto a wig while wearing it. You'd get powder everywhere in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, all over your clothes. So there was a specialized piece of equipment called a powder closet or powder room. This was literally a small closet or cabinet open at the front where you'd sit or stand while the powdering happened. You'd put on a powdering gown, a special garment designed to protect your clothes, and position your face just outside the closet while your wig-wearing head was inside. Then a servant would use bellows, or a special shaker to blow clouds of powder over your wig, coating it thoroughly and evenly. Can you imagine? Sitting there while clouds of starch powder billowed around your head, getting into your hair, your ears, settling on your shoulders despite the protective gown. The powder would be everywhere. Your servant would need to brush away the excess, but some would inevitably remain, creating a slight haze in the air, making you sneeze. And this happened every single day, or at minimum every few days, because the powder didn't last. It would absorb oil from the scalp, collect dust and dirt, start to look dingy. Fresh powder was essential to maintaining that crisp white appearance. But before you could powder a wig, you had to style it. And styling involved another substance that's crucial to understand: pomade. Pomade was a thick, greasy mixture, usually some combination of animal fat, beeswax, and scented oils, that was used to hold the hair in place and help it retain its curl. The pomade would be worked through the wig, section by section, coating each curl. Then the wig might be heated using special curling irons that were warmed over a flame to set the curls more permanently. This process had to be repeated regularly as the curls fell out or the style became disheveled. The smell. Oh, the smell. Let's talk about that for a moment, because it's not something portraits can convey. Pomade, made from animal fat, heated, applied to dead hair, left to sit for days or weeks. Add to that the bodies of the people wearing these wigs. Remember, daily bathing wasn't universal. The powder helped mask some of the odor, especially if it was scented. But there was definitely a distinctive smell associated with wig wearing. Some people loved it, found it aristocratic and refined. Others found it cloying and unpleasant. Contemporary accounts describe the atmosphere of crowded ballrooms where dozens of powdered wigs were present. Apparently it could be overwhelming, a mix of perfume, powder, pomade, and sweat. The maintenance required for wigs was significant. You couldn't just wear the same wig day after day without care. The pomade would collect dust, the powder would lose its brightness, the curls would fall. So wigs needed regular professional maintenance. Every week or two you'd send your wigs to a wig maker for cleaning and restyling. If you were wealthy, you owned multiple wigs, so you'd always have a fresh one available while others were being serviced. A gentleman might own a half-dozen wigs, different styles for different occasions, backups in case of accidents, extras being maintained at any given time, and accidents happened. Wigs could be ruined by rain, the powder would turn into a paste, the curls would straighten, the whole thing becoming a soggy mess. They could be damaged by candle flames. Remember, lighting was all fire-based in this era, and a large wig brought your hair much closer to candles. There are accounts of wigs catching fire at balls, the unfortunate wearer having to quickly remove the burning hairpiece and stamp it out, standing there red-faced and exposed while their wig smouldered on the floor. They could also be infested with lice or other parasites, which enjoyed the warm, greasy environment of a pomaded wig. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was a genuine health concern. The cost of maintaining this system was substantial. The initial purchase of a good wig was expensive, so a full court wig might cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled worker. Then there was the ongoing cost of powder, pomade, and professional maintenance. The powder alone, used daily, added up. During the 1790s, when Britain was at war with France and grain prices were rising, there was actually public outcry about wealthy men using food products, wheat and potato starch, on their hair. While poor people struggled to afford bread, this became a genuine political issue. In 1795, the British government actually imposed a tax on hair powder. The powder tax, as it was called, required anyone using powder to purchase an annual licence. The cost was 1 guinea, a significant sum. The stated purpose was to raise revenue for the war effort, but there was also a moral dimension. Using food on your head while people were hungry was starting to seem unconscionable. The tax had an immediate effect. Many people stopped powdering rather than pay. Within a few years, powdered hair had gone from universal among the upper classes to relatively rare. But the powder tax alone doesn't fully explain the rapid decline of wigs. Something bigger was happening. Remember those revolutionary ideas we discussed earlier? The French Revolution had erupted in 1789, and suddenly everything associated with the old aristocracy was suspect. Elaborate wigs were definitely associated with the aristocracy. They were expensive, impractical, ostentatious, everything the revolutionaries hated. In France, men literally stopped wearing wigs almost overnight. Appearing in an old-style powdered wig could mark you as an aristocrat, an enemy of the revolution. That could be dangerous. The fashion for natural hair spread rapidly. Men started wearing their own hair, cut shorter, unpowdered. This was influenced partly by the revolutionary egalitarianism. Your own hair was democratic, available to everyone regardless of wealth. But it was also influenced by Romanticism, the new cultural movement that valued nature, authenticity, spontaneity over artifice and formality. Wearing a dead person's hair covered in powder suddenly seemed grotesque, unnatural, false. Your own hair, however it looked, was real, honest, authentic. There's a portrait I want you to know about, because it captures this transition moment perfectly. It's of Archduke John of Austria, painted around 1795. He's wearing a powdered wig tied in a queue, a long tail at the back. And what makes this portrait significant is that he's described as the latest born notable person to be portrayed wearing one. After him, it essentially disappears from portraiture. Within a generation, the powdered wig went from absolutely essential to completely obsolete. Can you think of another fashion item that collapsed so completely, so quickly? It's remarkable. The transition wasn't always smooth. Older men particularly struggled to give up their wigs. They'd worn them for decades. Their natural hair might be thin or grey or unfashionable in cut. Going without a wig made them feel naked, exposed. There are accounts of elderly gentlemen clinging to their wigs well into the 1800s, becoming curiosities, objects of bemused attention. Young people would point and stare at the old man in the outdated wig, the way we might stare at someone today wearing truly bizarre vintage clothing. And what about all those wig makers? Entire professions had been built around this industry. Thousands of skilled craftsmen whose livelihood depended on making, maintaining, and powdering wigs. When the fashion collapsed, so did their industry. Some adapted, transitioning to making theatrical wigs, or serving the remaining conservative customers. Others retrained entirely, learning new trades. It was an economic disruption, a small example of how fashion changes can have real consequences for real people's lives. But here's what fascinates me most about the wig phenomenon. It shows how quickly something can go from absolutely necessary to absolutely ridiculous. In 1780, no gentleman would appear in public without his wig. It would be as unthinkable as going out naked. 20 years later, wearing a wig marked you as hopelessly old-fashioned, possibly reactionary, definitely out of touch, the same garment, same appearance, but the social meaning had completely reversed. Fashion isn't just about clothes, it's about shared agreement on what looks right, what's acceptable, what signals you're part of the group. When that agreement shifts, even the most entrenched fashion can collapse. And with the collapse of wigs came other changes. Hair care became about your actual hair rather than manufactured hairpieces. New products emerged, hair tonics, styling pomades that were less greasy than the old wig pomade, eventually hair dyes for those wanting to cover grey. The barbering profession changed, focusing on cutting and styling natural hair rather than wig maintenance. In a way, the end of wigs made men more connected to their own bodies, their own natural appearance. That was part of the broader trend we've been tracking, the move towards simplicity, authenticity, nature over artifice. But simplicity, as we keep discovering, doesn't mean easy. Even without wigs, men's fashion remained complicated, demanding, and occasionally absurd. And nowhere was this more true than in the one area we haven't fully explored yet: the collar. The standing collar, the starched collar. The collar so high and stiff that it literally immobilized your head. The collar that Victorian men would struggle with daily, that caused medical problems, that eventually became detachable because dealing with it was too difficult. The story of the collar is in many ways the story of 19th century men's fashion. Increasingly restrictive, increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly focused on control and conformity. So let's continue our journey by examining this small but tyrannical piece of fabric that wrapped around men's necks and in many ways strangled their freedom to move, to breathe, to be comfortable in their own bodies. Touch your neck right now. Go ahead, just run your fingers along your collar if you're wearing one. Feel how soft it is, how it moves with you, flexes when you turn your head, doesn't restrict your breathing. Now imagine that instead of soft fabric, your collar was made of linen starched so stiff it could almost stand up on its own. Imagine it rising up the sides of your neck, pressing against your jaw, the points jutting up toward your ears. Imagine trying to turn your head and finding you can't. The collar won't allow it. You'd have to turn your entire body. That was reality for fashionable men through much of the 19th century. The collar became a kind of torture device, socially mandatory, medically problematic, and yet absolutely essential to being considered properly dressed. This is the story of how a simple piece of fabric became an instrument of control, conformity, and considerable discomfort. The evolution of the collar is fascinating because it shows how fashion can take a functional item and transform it into something almost dysfunctional. Early in the 1800s, shirt collars were relatively modest. They stood up a few inches, just enough to frame the face and provide a foundation for the cravat. But as the century progressed, collars began to grow and grow and grow. By the 1820s, fashionable young men were wearing collars that came up to their jawline. By the 1830s, the most extreme dandies wore collars that reached their cheekbones. And in rare cases, rare, but documented, some men wore collars so high they actually touched the bottom of their ears. Why would anyone do this? The answer is the same as always, because fashion demanded it, and fashion was a form of social communication you couldn't opt out of without consequences. But there was also an aesthetic theory behind it. Remember how we talked about the neoclassical ideal, the idea that the neck wrapped in white linen should resemble a Grecian column? The higher the collar, the more dramatic this effect. Your head literally appeared to rest on a white pillar like a classical statue. The rigid, upright posture enforced by a high collar also contributed to an air of dignity and formality. You looked important partly because you looked uncomfortable. The discomfort itself was a status signal, proof that you could afford to prioritize appearance over ease. The starch was crucial to achieving the right level of stiffness. We've touched on starching before with cravats, but collar starching was its own specialized art. The starch had to be applied evenly and in the right concentration. Too little and the collar would wilt, flopping against your neck instead of standing proud. Too much and it would crack, creating unsightly creases, or even breaking apart entirely. The ideal was a collar that stood rigidly upright while still retaining a slight flexibility that prevented complete fracture when you moved. The starching process required skill and time. The collar would be washed first because any dirt or oil would prevent the starch from adhering properly. Then it would be dipped in starch solution. Rice starch was considered the best, creating the crispest finish. The excess starch had to be wrung out carefully, leaving just the right amount in the fabric. Then came drying, which had to happen smoothly to avoid wrinkles. Finally, the collar would be ironed while still slightly damp, the hot iron pressing the linen flat and activating the starch to create that board-like stiffness. The timing of the ironing was critical. Too wet and the starch wouldn't set properly. Too dry and you couldn't achieve a smooth finish. A well-starched collar was a work of art, genuinely. It would stand up crisply, the edges sharp enough to almost cut, the surface smooth and gleaming white. But maintaining this perfection was nearly impossible. The collar would begin to wilt almost as soon as you put it on. Your body heat, the oil from your skin, the mere act of swallowing, all of these would gradually soften the starch. By the end of a day, what had started as a crisp, upright collar might have become limp and sad-looking. This meant that truly fastidious men changed their collars multiple times per day. A fresh collar for morning, another for afternoon, a third for evening. Each change required a servant to help you remove the old collar and attach the new one. And this brings us to one of the most significant innovations in 19th century menswear, the detachable collar. This invention, which emerged in the 1840s, was revolutionary. Instead of the collar being sewn onto the shirt as a permanent fixture, it became a separate piece that attached with studs or buttons. This might sound like a small thing, but it solved several major problems. First, it meant you could change your collar without changing your entire shirt. Second, it meant the collar could be starched separately, achieving levels of stiffness that would be impossible if it were attached to the rest of the shirt. And third, it meant that laundering was easier. You could send just the collar to be washed and starched, rather than the whole shirt. But the detachable collar created its own complications. Now you had to attach the collar every time you dressed. This wasn't a simple matter of buttoning it on. The collar had small buttonholes at the front and back that aligned with corresponding studs on your shirt. You'd insert a stud through the shirt fabric and through the collar buttonhole, securing it in place. The studs were usually made of metal or mother of pearl, small and fiddly. Getting the front stud through both layers of fabric while holding the stiff collar in position required dexterity and patience. The back stud was even worse. You couldn't see what you were doing. You were working behind your neck and the starched collar was fighting you the whole way. Many men required assistance with this process. Your servant, wife, or mother might help you fasten your collar in the morning. There are accounts of men standing in their dressing rooms, arms raised helplessly, while someone else wrestled with the back collar stud. And if a stud fell, which happened frequently, because they were small and you were working partially by feel, you'd have to start over. Studs would roll under furniture, disappear into cracks in the floorboards, become maddeningly lost. Men learned to keep spare studs readily available because you could not appear in public with your collar unfastened. The collars themselves came in various styles, and the style you chose said something about you. There were standing collars that rose straight up, wing collars where the points folded down at the front, turn-down collars where the entire upper edge folded over. In the 1850s and 60s, standing collars dominated. By the 1870s, wing collars were fashionable. By the 1880s and 90s, turn-down collars were becoming common for day wear, though standing collars remained required for formal occasions. Knowing which style to wear when was yet another rule to master, another way to demonstrate your understanding of proper dress. The height of the collar varied too, and this became a way for young men to signal their fashionability. Conservative older men might wear collars 2 inches high. Fashionable younger men pushed higher, 2.5 inches, 3 inches, occasionally even more. These extreme collars were mockingly called poppadom collars, or father killers, the latter name suggesting they might choke you to death. And this wasn't entirely a joke. The medical consequences of high, tight collars were real and documented. Doctors of the Victorian era wrote about what they called collar-related afflictions. Tight collars could restrict blood flow to the brain, causing headaches, dizziness, even fainting. They pressed on nerves in the neck, leading to numbness or tingling in the hands and arms. The constant pressure could cause skin irritation, rashes, and infections. Some men developed chronic neck pain from the strain of holding their heads in an unnatural position all day. There are even accounts of men who developed digestive problems. Apparently, the rigid posture enforced by a stiff collar affected the position of the stomach and intestines, interfering with the normal digestion. And yet men kept wearing these collars. They kept submitting to this daily discomfort because the social cost of not wearing them was higher than the physical cost of wearing them. Think about that. Physical pain, medical problems, daily struggle, all preferable to being seen as poorly dressed, as someone who didn't understand or follow the rules. That's the power of fashion, the power of social conformity. It can convince people to voluntarily endure suffering. The collar also restricted movement in ways we've touched on but haven't fully appreciated. You couldn't nod your head easily. The collar prevented the downward tilt. You couldn't look up without tilting your entire upper body back. You couldn't tuck your chin down, which made reading difficult. You had to hold the book or newspaper up at eye level, rather than looking down at it. You couldn't turn your head to look to the side. You had to turn your whole body. All of these restrictions created a distinctive way of moving, a kind of stiff formality that became associated with respectability and proper masculine bearing. There's a social dimension to this that's worth considering. A man in a stiff high collar couldn't slouch, couldn't adopt a casual posture, couldn't look relaxed. He was constantly held in a state of formal uprightness. This physical rigidity reflected and reinforced social rigidity. The Victorian era was obsessed with propriety, with rules, with maintaining strict social hierarchies. The collar was a physical manifestation of these values, literally keeping men in line, preventing them from being too casual, too comfortable, too free in their movements. Every time a man felt that stiff collar against his neck, he was reminded to maintain proper decorum, proper distance, proper formality. The whiteness of the collar was significant too. White shows every speck of dirt, every tiny stain. A white collar proclaimed that you had the resources to keep it clean, servants to wash and starch it, multiple collars to rotate through, enough wealth that you didn't have to worry about the expense. White collars were a class marker as much as a fashion choice. Working men wore coloured shirts or soft, non-starched collars precisely because white stiff collars were impractical for actual labour. If you wore a white starched collar, you were announcing that you didn't do physical work, that you could afford to wear something fragile and impractical. The collar industry that grew up around this fashion was substantial. By the late 1800s, there were factories dedicated solely to manufacturing detachable collars. Brands emerged, advertising their collars as superior in stiffness, durability, or style. Men developed preferences. Some swore by one brand, others by another. Department stores would have entire sections devoted to collars, displaying dozens of styles and sizes. And yes, sizes. Collars had to fit precisely around your neck. Too loose and they'd gap unfashionably. Too tight and they'd be even more uncomfortable than necessary, potentially cutting off circulation. You needed to know your exact neck measurement, usually specified in quarter-inch increments. The laundering of these collars became an industry as well. Laundries specialized in collar service, promising crisp starching and pristine whiteness. A gentleman might send out a dozen collars at a time, receiving them back stiff and gleaming, ready to wear. The cost of this service was ongoing and significant, another expense in the long list of what it cost to be a fashionable man. But it was considered money well spent, because appearing with a limp or dirty collar would be mortifying. There's a detail I find particularly telling about the tyranny of the collar. Men learn to sleep on their backs. Why? Because if you slept on your side, your collar would press into your cheek, leaving marks that would be visible the next morning. Or worse, the collar might become crushed or wrinkled overnight, requiring you to change it first thing upon waking. So men trained themselves to sleep in a position that wouldn't disturb their collars. That's dedication to fashion, letting it dictate not just how you dressed, but how you slept. The grip of the collar began to loosen toward the end of the Victorian era and into the Edwardian period. Collars remained important, but they gradually became lower, softer, more forgiving. The extreme heights of the mid-1800s were not returning. By the early 1900s, soft attached collars were becoming acceptable for casual wear, though detachable stiff collars remained standard for business and formal occasions. The full transition away from stiff collars didn't happen until after World War I, when the informality of wartime and the changing pace of life made them seem absurdly old-fashioned. But even today, the collar remains symbolically important. White collar versus blue collar workers, that distinction comes directly from this era, from the time when white starched collars marked you as someone who worked in an office rather than a factory. The suit collar, even soft and comfortable as it is now, still frames the face, still signals formality, still carries echoes of that Victorian obsession with rigid propriety. We've escaped the worst of the discomfort, but the symbolic power remains. As we near the end of our journey through the complications of men's fashion, we're seeing a pattern emerge. Each element, the cravat, the waistcoat, the wig, the collar, that's with a practical function or aesthetic goal. But then it escalates, becoming more elaborate, more extreme, more demanding, until finally it collapses or moderates under the weight of its own absurdity. The collar followed this pattern, and so did the next element we need to examine, the trousers themselves. Because while we touched on breeches and the transition to long trousers earlier, we haven't fully explored the sheer complexity that tight trousers introduced to men's lives. The engineering required to create pants that fit like a second skin, the assistance needed to get into them, the complete inability to move naturally once you had them on. That's a story that brings together everything we've been discussing. So take a deep breath, loosen that imaginary collar around your neck, and let's continue into the fascinating, frustrating world of tight trousers and the men who loved and suffered in them. Here's a question that might seem absurd at first. Have you ever needed two other people to help you put on your pants? Not because of an injury or disability, but because your pants were cut so impossibly tight that getting into them required assistance, coordination, and sometimes actual physical force? For fashionable men in the early to mid-1800s, this wasn't unusual. It was Tuesday morning, the pursuit of the perfect silhouette, trousers that revealed every line of the leg that fit like they'd been painted on, led to garments so restrictive that the simple act of getting dressed became a complex operation requiring help, patience, and occasionally prayer. This is the story of how men's trousers went from being a practical garment to being an engineering challenge, and what that tells us about the lengths people will go to for fashion. We've mentioned tight trousers before in passing, but let me really paint the picture of what we're dealing with here. When I say tight, I don't mean snug, I don't mean fitted, I mean tight in a way that modern stretch fabrics have made us forget was even possible. These trousers were cut from materials with absolutely no give. Buckskin, leather, fine wool, occasionally even silk. The fabric didn't stretch, not even a little bit, and yet they were tailored to fit so closely to the leg that you could see the individual contours of the muscles beneath. Every curve, every line, every anatomical detail was on display. This wasn't accidental. This was the entire point. The aesthetic goal was called the Grecian ideal, the idea that the male body properly displayed resembled classical statuary. Greek and Roman sculptures showed athletic male figures with clearly defined musculature, and fashionable men wanted to achieve that same effect with their clothing. But here's the catch. Those statues were naked. Trying to achieve the same visual effect while wearing clothes required clothes that functioned almost like a second skin. Hence, the absurdly tight trousers. Let me walk you through the process of getting into a pair of these trousers, because it's genuinely fascinating in its complexity. You'd start by sitting down. Standing simply wouldn't work. Your servant, because you absolutely needed a servant for this, would bring the trousers to you. Now remember Brummel's invention of the stirrup strap we mentioned earlier? That strap that passed under the foot to keep the trouser leg taut? That was standard by this point. So the servant would first help you insert your foot through the bottom of the trouser leg and into the stirrup. Then came the hard part. The servant would begin working the tight fabric up your leg. This wasn't a smooth process. The buckskin or wool had to be pulled, smoothed, coaxed upward inch by inch. Your leg had to be extended straight because any bend in the knee would make it impossible to get the fabric past. The servant would pull from the waistband while you pushed with your leg, the two of you working in tandem to force the unyielding fabric upward. And this was just one leg. You'd have to repeat the entire process for the other side. Once both legs were finally up, you'd stand carefully because the trousers were still not fully in place. The servant would continue pulling at the waistband, working the trousers up over your hips and into final position. This required considerable force. There are accounts of servants literally putting their knee against the gentleman's posterior and pulling with both hands to get the trousers that final few inches into place. Imagine that scene for a moment. Your servant bracing against you, yanking on your waistband with all their strength, while you try to maintain your dignity and not fall over. It's almost comical, except it was deadly serious business at the time. But we're not done yet. Once the trousers were up, they had to be fastened. In the early 1800s, most trousers still used the full front closure we discussed with breeches, that panel that buttoned at the sides. Getting these buttons fastened while the fabric was under such tension was challenging. The buttonholes were small and the fabric was taut, fighting against your attempts to button it. Your fingers might be cramping from the effort, but you had to persist because you certainly couldn't appear with your trousers unfastened. And here's where it gets even more extreme. Some men, particularly the most fashionable dandies, wore trousers so tight that normal fastening wasn't possible. The fabric simply wouldn't allow enough movement for buttons and buttonholes to function. The solution? They had themselves sewn into their trousers. Yes, literally sewn. The servant would use needle and thread to stitch the front closure shut, with the gentleman standing there unable to move, basically being sewn into his own clothes. These stitches would remain in place all day. When it was time to undress, and when nature called, which presented its own problems, the servant would have to carefully cut the stitches to free the gentleman from his trousers. Can you imagine living like this? being literally trapped in your own clothing, dependent on servants not just for help but for basic freedom of movement. And yet fashionable men submitted to this willingly, even eagerly, because the silhouette was everything. A perfect line, a flawless fit, that was worth the inconvenience, the discomfort, the sheer absurdity of being sewn into your pants every morning. The fit wasn't just tight in the legs, the entire trouser was engineered for maximum effect. The waist sat high, emphasizing a trim waistline. The seat, the posterior area, was cut to be smooth and fitted, revealing the shape without any excess fabric or wrinkles. The thighs, as we've discussed, were skin-tight, and the stirrup strap kept everything taut from waist to ankle, creating an unbroken line of fabric that looked almost painted on. But what happened when you actually had to move in these trousers? The answer is, very carefully, you couldn't just plop into a chair. The trousers wouldn't allow the necessary flexibility. You had to lower yourself slowly, keeping your legs as straight as possible, perching on the edge of the seat rather than settling back. Standing up again required planning and effort. You'd push yourself up with your arms, using the chair arms for leverage, keeping your legs straight as you rose. Quick movements were impossible. Running? Forget it. Even walking required a certain stiffness, a restricted gait that actually became part of the fashionable gentleman's bearing. Bending over was particularly problematic. The tight fit in the seat and thighs meant you couldn't bend at the waist or knees without risking a tear, or worse, a catastrophic split. There are accounts, and I want you to know these are from actual historical sources, not exaggerations, of gentlemen who bent to pick something up and had their trousers split dramatically from waist to knee. The mortification was absolute. You'd have to retreat immediately, perhaps wrapping your coat around your waist to hide the damage, and get home as quickly as possible to change. Some men started carrying spare trousers in their carriage, just in case of such disasters. The material choice was crucial to achieving the right fit. Buckskin, leather from deer, was prized because it molded to the body and, when slightly damp, could be stretched into shape. Some men would actually wear buckskin trousers, get them wet, and then wear them until they dried, allowing the leather to shrink and conform perfectly to their legs. This created an incredibly precise fit, but it also meant the trousers could only be worn by that specific person. They were literally shaped to one individual's body. You couldn't lend your buckskin trousers to a friend, they wouldn't fit properly. Wool was also popular, particularly fine wool with a slight nap that gave it grip against the skin. The wool had to be of high quality. Cheap wool would bag at the knees or seat after wearing, ruining the sleek line. The best wool trousers were made from fabric woven so finely it almost felt like silk, and they cost accordingly. A pair of properly tailored wool trousers from a top tailor might cost several pounds, a week's wages or more for a working man. The tailoring itself was an art. Tailors who specialized in trousers, and yes, specialization had reached the point where you might have a different tailor for your trousers than for your coat, developed techniques for achieving the impossibly tight fit fashionable men demanded. They used multiple fittings, carefully marking adjustments, cutting and recutting until the fit was perfect. Some tailors guaranteed their work, promising that if the trousers split during normal wear, they'd repair or replace them. This guarantee was necessary because the failure rate was quite high. When you're working at the absolute limit of what fabric can do, failures are inevitable. There was also the question of what you wore under these tight trousers. The answer, for many fashionable men, was nothing. Undergarments would create visible lines, bunching irregularities in the smooth surface. So many men wore their trousers directly against their skin. This was considered somewhat scandalous. There are satirical cartoons from the period mocking men for their indecency. But it was necessary to achieve the desired look. Some men wore very thin, tight-fitting undergarments made of silk or fine cotton, but even these could potentially show under the trousers. The hourglass silhouette we mentioned earlier, the fashionable male shape of the 1820s and 30s, depended heavily on the tight trousers. The look was broad shoulders, narrow waist, and slim legs. Achieving broad shoulders required coat construction, which we've touched on. The narrow waist was partly natural physique, partly achieved through tailoring that drew the coat in tightly at the waist and sometimes, though men would never admit it, aided by wearing stays or corsets. Yes, some fashionable men wore corsets. Not many, and it was kept very quiet, but it happened. And the slim legs? That was all about the trousers. The tighter they were, the more they contributed to the desired silhouette. But this fashion came with costs beyond discomfort. There were medical concerns. Doctors warned that excessively tight trousers could interfere with circulation, causing numbness in the legs or even more serious vascular problems. There were concerns about reproductive health. The compression couldn't be good for that area of male anatomy. And there were digestive issues because the high tight waistband pressed on the stomach and intestines. Fashion magazines occasionally published articles urging moderation, warning young men not to sacrifice their health for appearance. These warnings were generally ignored. There's a wonderful satirical piece from 1832 that I wish I could share in full, but I'll give you the essence. It's written as if by a physician, detailing the various ailments afflicting fashionable young men and attributing them all to tight clothing. Headaches from tight collars, indigestion from tight waistbands, poor circulation from tight trousers, respiratory problems from tight-laced coats. The author suggests that if you lined up a fashionable gentleman and a labourer of the same age, the labourer would be healthier, stronger, more capable in every physical respect, despite the gentleman's superior diet and living conditions. Why? Because the gentleman was slowly strangling himself with his own clothes. The satire wasn't far from truth. There really was a kind of physical debilitation that came with fashionable dress. Men who wore tight, restrictive clothing from adolescence onward developed differently than men who didn't. Their muscles adapted to limited range of motion. Their posture was shaped by rigid collars and tight waistbands. Some became genuinely unable to move in natural, unrestricted ways even when they weren't wearing fashionable clothes. The fashion had literally reshaped their bodies. And yet despite all of this, the difficulty, the discomfort, the health risks, the occasional splits and embarrassments, men kept wearing tight trousers. Through the 1820s, 30s and 40s, the fashion persisted. It only began to ease in the 1850s, when looser cuts started becoming acceptable. But even then, the change was gradual. Victorian men still wore fitted trousers, just not quite as impossibly tight as their predecessors. The idea that trousers should be loose enough to allow comfortable movement didn't fully take hold until the late 1800s. What finally killed the extremely tight trouser? Partly changing aesthetics, new ideals of masculinity that valued strength and vigour over static display. Partly practical concerns, as more men worked in offices and needed to sit comfortably for long periods. Partly medical knowledge, doctors became more vocal about the health risks, and partly just fashion cycling as it always does, with the new generation rejecting the extremes of the old. By the early 1900s, a gentleman in trousers as tight as Brummel would have worn would look ridiculous, anachronistic, perhaps a bit pathetic. The pendulum had swung, but here's what strikes me about the tight trouser phenomenon. It shows how far the disconnect can go between appearance and function. These were garments that made it difficult to perform basic activities, sitting, walking, bending. They were expensive, required servants to put on, and could literally fall apart if you moved wrong. And yet they were considered not just acceptable but essential for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously in fashionable society. Fashion had completely divorced itself from practicality. existing purely as aesthetic display and social signaling. The tight trouser was the ultimate expression of fashion as performance, as suffering for beauty, as the willingness to sacrifice comfort and even health for the sake of appearance. As we near the end of our journey through men's complicated fashion, we've seen this pattern again and again. Every element, cravats, collars, waistcoats, wigs, trousers, starts with some practical or aesthetic purpose and then escalates beyond reason. But we haven't yet talked about the finishing touch in the accessories that tied the whole ensemble together. The buttons that cost more than most people earned in a year, the buckles that were family heirlooms, the canes that served no functional purpose but were absolutely essential, the pocket watches that told time but mostly told status. These details, these small touches, were where gentlemen could still show individuality, wealth, and taste in an increasingly uniform world of dark suits. So let's continue into this realm of expensive trivialities, these tiny items that loomed so large in the fashionable man's consciousness. The devil, they say, is in the details. And nowhere was this more true than in the world of 18th and 19th century men's fashion, where a gentleman's worth could be judged by examining the buttons on his coat, the buckles on his shoes, the chain on his watch, or the head of his walking stick. These weren't just functional objects, they were miniature artworks, status symbols, conversation pieces, and sometimes family heirlooms worth more than houses. While the overall silhouette of men's clothing was becoming increasingly standardized, these small accessories remained a space for luxury, creativity, and conspicuous consumption. This is the story of how the smallest details carried the biggest messages, and how men poured fortunes into objects most people today wouldn't give a second glance. Let's start with buttons, because their story is absolutely fascinating. Today, buttons are purely functional. We barely notice them unless one falls off. But in the 17 and 1800s, buttons were jewellery. They were art, they were investments. A set of fine buttons could cost more than the coat they adorned, and some men owned collections of buttons they'd swap between garments, changing the entire feel of an outfit simply by changing the buttons. The variety was extraordinary. There were buttons carved from ivory, showing intricate scenes in miniature. Hunting parties, classical ruins, pastoral landscapes, all rendered in minute detail on a surface smaller than a coin. There were buttons made of mother-of-pearl, cut thin enough to be translucent, catching light and throwing rainbow iridescence. There were enamel buttons, where coloured glass was fused onto metal in elaborate patterns, flowers, geometric designs, family crests. Some buttons contained miniature paintings under glass domes, portraits of loved ones or scenes from mythology rendered by skilled artists working with brushes that had only a few hairs. Metal buttons were particularly prized. Silver buttons were common among the wealthy, but gold buttons, those were truly special. Some gold buttons were plain, relying on the warm gleam of the metal itself for their appeal. Others were chased or engraved with patterns, the goldsmith's tools creating texture and detail in the soft metal. Still others were set with gemstones, not enormous jewels, but small diamonds, rubies, sapphires, or semi-precious stones, each button a tiny piece of jewellery in itself. There are documented cases of button sets worth hundreds of pounds, literal fortunes compressed into a dozen small objects sewn onto a coat. And here's a detail that really brings home how valuable these buttons were. They were removable. Not easily removable like modern buttons, but they were designed to be taken off and put on different garments. When a coat wore out or went out of fashion, you didn't discard the buttons. You carefully removed them and transferred them to your new coat. Some button sets passed down through generations, family heirlooms that outlasted dozens of coats. There are museum collections today containing button sets over 2 centuries old, still in perfect condition because they were treasured and cared for. The buttons weren't just on the front of coats either. They appeared on cuffs, usually 3 or 4 per sleeve, purely decorative since coat sleeves didn't actually unbutton. They appeared on the back vents of coat tails. They appeared on waistcoats, sometimes a dozen or more down the front. A fully dressed gentleman might be wearing 30 or 40 buttons at once, each one potentially expensive, each one contributing to the overall impression of wealth and taste. There's a wonderful anecdote from 1719 that perfectly captures the button obsession. A satirical play called Le Mode was performed in Paris, and one scene mocked the current fashion for incredibly tiny buttons. The play suggested the buttons had become so small that you needed a microscope to see them. This was an exaggeration, obviously, but it was based on real trends. Buttons did get quite small for a period, and the joke was that men were so obsessed with fashionable wool buttons that practicality had been completely abandoned. A few decades later, the pendulum swung the other way, and enormous buttons became fashionable, some as large as small saucers. Fashion is nothing if not cyclical in its absurdities. Now let's talk about shoe buckles, because they deserve their own moment of appreciation. In the 17 and 1800s, fashionable men didn't wear laced shoes. They wore shoes with buckles, large decorative buckles positioned prominently on the front of each shoe. And these weren't simple utilitarian buckles. These were statements, works of art, expressions of wealth and status that happened to also hold your shoes on. The size of shoe buckles grew dramatically through the 1700s. Early in the century, buckles might be an inch or 2 across. By mid-century, they were commonly 3 or 4 inches. By the 1770s and 80s, some fashionable men wore buckles that were 5 or 6 inches across, essentially covering the entire front of the shoe. These enormous buckles were heavy, sometimes several ounces of metal each, and they made the shoes harder to wear, but they were undeniably impressive. The materials were similar to buttons: silver, gold, sometimes even platinum. The buckles might be plain polished metal, or they might be decorated with engraving, chasing, or gem settings. Diamond shoe buckles were the ultimate luxury item. Not just a diamond or 2 as accents, but buckles entirely set with diamonds, hundreds of small stones creating a surface that glittered with every step. Such buckles cost fortunes. Some sets were worth more than a substantial house. They were worn to the most formal occasions, where the candlelight would make them flash and sparkle, drawing every eye to the wearer's feet. But here's what's interesting about shoe buckles: they were also deeply political. In the late 1700s, particularly after the French Revolution, wearing elaborate shoe buckles became associated with aristocratic ostentation. Revolutionary sentiment favoured simple laced shoes as more egalitarian, more practical, more honest. Men who continued wearing fancy buckles were making a political statement, intentionally or not. By the early 1800s, buckles were definitely on their way out, replaced by simple laces or low-profile clasps. The age of the elaborate shoe buckle had ended, another victim of the shift towards simplicity and practicality we've been tracking throughout this story. The walking stick, or cane, as it was also called, is another accessory that deserves attention. Now, many gentlemen carried walking sticks that were actually functional. If you were walking any distance, particularly on uneven ground, a stick was genuinely useful. But fashionable men in cities carried canes that had nothing to do with walking assistance. These were purely decorative accessories, status symbols that you carried in your hand or tucked under your arm to complete your ensemble. The cane became essentially a piece of jewellery you held rather than wore. The stick itself might be made of exotic woods, ebony from Africa, bamboo from Asia, rare tropical hardwoods with beautiful grain patterns. Or it might be covered in decorated leather or wrapped in precious metal wire. But the real focus was the handle. The handle of a fashionable cane could be made from almost anything valuable. Ivory carved into elaborate shapes, silver cast in the form of animal heads, gold set with gemstones, even crystal or semi-precious stones cut and polished to fit perfectly in the hand. Some cane handles were quite large and elaborate. Imagine holding a small sculpture in your hand as you walked. Others were more modest but made of incredibly precious materials. There are cane handles in museum collections made from single pieces of jade, amber or coral, materials that were rare and expensive even in their own time, now priceless for their age and provenance. A gentleman might own several canes, choosing which to carry based on his outfit, the occasion, or simply his mood that day. The way you carried your cane was significant too. There were rules, unwritten but universally understood, about proper cane deportment. You didn't lean on it. That would suggest weakness or actual need for support. You carried it lightly, perhaps dangling it from your fingers, or tucked under your arm or held loosely at your side. The cane should look effortless, an ornament rather than a tool. Some young dandies developed elaborate ways of twirling or manipulating their canes, little tricks and flourishes that drew attention and demonstrated their dexterity. There are satirical cartoons showing dandies so focused on their cane twirling that they weren't watching where they were going, walking into lampposts or other pedestrians. Now we come to pocket watches, and here we enter a realm of true obsession. The pocket watch was more than a timepiece. It was a portable status symbol, a mechanical marvel, a piece of fine jewellery, and a practical tool all in one. By the late 1700s and into the 1800s, no gentleman was properly dressed without a watch. It lived in your waistcoat pocket, attached to a chain or fob that was visible even when the watch itself was concealed. That chain or fob was itself an accessory that deserved attention and expense. Watch chains were typically made of gold or silver, with links that might be plain or elaborately decorated. Some men wore heavy chains with large links, making a bold statement of wealth. Several ounces of gold draped across your waistcoat was hard to miss. Others preferred more delicate chains but attached multiple decorative elements, small charms, seals, keys, ornamental fobs that hung from the chain, creating a cascade of small objects. It wasn't unusual for a gentleman to have a dozen different items hanging from his watch chain, each one representing something: a club membership, a university affiliation, a family connection. The watch itself, when revealed, was expected to be impressive. The outer case might be plain gold or silver, or it might be decorated with engraving, enamel, or gemstones. Opening the case revealed the face, which might have elaborate numerals, decorative hands, and subsidiary dials showing seconds or date. But the real connoisseur looked at the movement, the mechanism inside. A fine watch with a complicated movement featuring multiple functions and showing the watchmaker's skill was a prized possession. Men knew their watches, could discuss the merits of different makers, and took pride in owning timepieces from renowned craftsmen. There's a detail about watch wearing that's worth noting. Many fashionable men wore 2 watches, one in each waistcoat pocket, each with its own chain. Why? Partly for redundancy. If one stopped, you still had the time. Partly for show, 2 gold watch chains across your waistcoat was more impressive than one. And partly because watches weren't always perfectly accurate, so you could compare them and estimate the true time. Yes, that's right. Men wore 2 watches to try to figure out what time it actually was. It seems absurd, but it made sense in an era before standardized time and reliable timekeeping. Seals deserve a mention too. These were small stamps, usually attached to watch chains. The act could be used to seal letters with wax. The seal would have a design cut into it in reverse, a family crest, initials, or a personal emblem. When pressed into hot wax, it would leave a raised impression. In an age before reliable mail system and secure envelopes, A sealed letter with your personal seal was important. It showed the letter hadn't been opened in transit. But seals also became fashion accessories, chosen as much for their beauty as their function. Some men collected seals, changing which one they attached to their watch chain based on whim or occasion. Snuff boxes are another category of accessory worth exploring. Snuff, powdered tobacco that you inhaled through your nose, was popular among fashionable men in the 1800s, and the box you kept it in was yet another opportunity for display. Snuff boxes ranged from simple metal containers to elaborate works of art. Gold snuff boxes with enamel scenes, silver boxes with intricate engraving, tortoise-shell boxes with gold or silver inlay. These were objects of beauty that happened to hold tobacco. The ritual of taking snuff was itself a performance. You'd remove your snuff box from your pocket with a flourish, open it with one hand. There was a knack to this, a way of flipping open the lid that looked effortless and elegant. Take a pinch between thumb and forefinger. Raise it to your nose with a particular motion that was neither too fast nor too slow. Inhale, close the box with the snap. The whole process was choreographed, an opportunity to display your box, your dexterity, your sophistication. Men practiced these movements until they could perform them without thinking, the way you might practice shuffling cards or any other manual skill. What strikes me about all these accessories is how they functioned as a language. Each item communicated something. The buttons on your coat told people about your wealth and taste. The buckles on your shoes indicated whether you were fashionably current or conservatively traditional. Your cane suggested your social circle. Certain styles were associated with particular clubs or groups. Your watch chain revealed your affiliations and achievements through the charms and fobs you had attached. Your snuff box hinted at your sophistication and refinement. Every visible object was a word in a complex sentence that others could read and interpret. And unlike your coat or trousers, which were relatively fixed once you'd dressed, you could change your accessories relatively easily. Swap your watch chain, choose a different cane, use a different snuff box. These small changes could transform your presentation. It gave men a flexibility and expressiveness that the increasingly rigid rules about coats and trousers denied them. The accessories were the safety valve, the place where personality could still shine through in an increasingly uniform world. But all of this luxury, this obsession with detail, this pouring of wealth into small objects, it came at a cost. Not just financial, though certainly that, but social and personal. The next chapter of our story involves examining what happened to men who couldn't keep up with these demands, who spent beyond their means trying to maintain fashionable appearances, who drove themselves to financial ruin in pursuit of the perfect wardrobe. We've touched on Brummel's eventual bankruptcy, but he was far from alone. The cost of being fashionable, not just in money, but in time, effort, and psychological strain, was substantial, and for some men, it proved ruinous. So let's turn now to the darker side of this glittering world, to the bankruptcies and exile, the gambling debts and desperate measures, the price that men paid for living in a world where appearance was everything and fashion was a merciless master. Every fairy tale has its dark underbelly, and the glittering world of men's fashion was no exception. Behind the perfectly tied cravats, the gleaming boots, the expensive waistcoats, there lurked a shadow, the crushing weight of debt. For every man who successfully navigated the expensive waters of fashionable society, there were dozens who drowned in them, pulled under by tailor bills they couldn't pay, gambling losses they couldn't cover, and social expectations they couldn't meet. This is the story of what happened when the dream of being perfectly dressed collided with the reality of limited funds, when the pressure to maintain appearances drove men to desperate measures, and when the price of fashion turned out to be everything they had. And at the centre of this cautionary tale stands Bo Brummel himself, the man who defined an era and then lost everything pursuing the very standards he'd created. Let's start with the numbers, because they're genuinely staggering. Brummel's annual expenditure on clothing alone was estimated at somewhere between £800 and £1,000 per year. To put that in perspective, a comfortable middle-class family, a doctor, a lawyer, a successful merchant might live on £200 or £300 annually. A skilled craftsman might earn £50 to £80 a year. Brummel was spending on clothes alone what would support multiple families for a year, and that was just the clothing. Add in his living expenses, his servants, his club memberships, his entertainment, his gambling, and his total expenditure was probably closer to £3,000 or £4,000 annually. Where was this money coming from? Brummel's father had left him an inheritance of around £30,000 when he died. £30,000 sounds like a fortune, and it was, invested conservatively, it could have provided a comfortable income for life. But Brummel wasn't conservative. He was spending capital, not living on the interest. He was burning through his inheritance at an alarming rate, assuming, as young men often do, that somehow more money would appear, that his luck would hold, that the future would take care of itself. But the future doesn't take care of itself. By his late 30s, Brummel was in serious financial trouble. The inheritance was gone. He'd been borrowing money to maintain his lifestyle, taking loans from friends, running up bills with his tailors and bootmakers and shirt makers. These tradesmen extended credit willingly at first. Brummel was the most famous fashion figure in England, the man whose patronage could make a tailor's reputation. If Brummel wore your coats, other wealthy men would want them too, so the tailors let the bills accumulate assuming he'd eventually pay, but eventually never came. By 1816, Brummel owed thousands of pounds to various creditors. The exact figure is hard to pin down because he was secretive about his debts, but estimates range from £7,000 to £10,000, a staggering sum, equivalent to several £100,000 in modern money. His creditors were losing patience. Some were threatening legal action. In England, at this time, you could be imprisoned for debt. Debtors' prisons were real, and they were grim. You'd be locked up until you somehow paid what you owed, which was nearly impossible when you were in prison and couldn't work. Plenty of people spent years, even decades, in debtors' prison. Some died there. Brummel faced a choice: stay in England and probably end up in prison, or flee to the continent where English creditors couldn't reach him. In May of 1816 he chose exile. He left England in the middle of the night, crossing to France, leaving behind his debts, his reputation, his entire life. He was 38 years old. He would never return to England. He would die in France, in poverty and madness 24 years later. The story of those final years is heartbreaking. Brummel settled first in Calais, a French port town where many English debtors fled because it was close to England but beyond the reach of English law. He lived there for 14 years, surviving on remittances from friends in England who took pity on him. The British government eventually appointed him to a minor consular position, essentially a charity post with a small salary, but it wasn't nearly enough to support the lifestyle he'd once led. He lived in gradually declining circumstances, moving to smaller and cheaper lodgings, selling off his possessions one by one, and he kept trying to dress well. That's what breaks my heart about the story. Even in exile, even in poverty, Brummel clung to his standards of dress. He couldn't afford new clothes, so he wore his old ones, carefully maintained, meticulously brushed and mended. He couldn't afford a servant, so he cared for his clothes himself. Witnesses described seeing him in the 1820s and 30s still wearing coats from his London heyday, now shiny with age and wear, carefully turned, and repaired to hide the worst of the damage. He still spent hours on his cravat, still polished his boots to a high shine, still maintained the appearance of a gentleman even as everything else fell apart. But appearance can only carry you so far. His debts in Calais accumulated. The money from friends dried up as they died or forgot about him. By 1835, his creditors in France, new creditors, because he'd been borrowing there too, lost patience. He was thrown into debtor's prison. He spent several months there before friends secured his release. The experience broke something in him. His health, never robust, deteriorated. His mind began to fail, likely syphilis, which he'd contracted years earlier, now entering its final stages, causing dementia and physical decay. In 1840, he was declared insane and committed to an asylum on the outskirts of Caen. Le Bon Sauveur, it was called, the Good Saviour. He lived there for the final months of his life, increasingly disconnected from reality, sometimes not recognizing visitors, sometimes having lucid moments where he'd talk about his glory days in London, about the prince, about the parties and the adulation. He died there on March 30th, 1840. He was 61 years old. He was buried in a pauper's section of a Protestant cemetery in Caen, far from England, far from the glittering world he'd once ruled. The man who'd defined masculine elegance for a generation, who'd influenced how every gentleman in the Western world dressed, died alone, mad and poor. There's a lesson in that, isn't there? About the dangers of living beyond your means, about the emptiness of a life devoted purely to appearance, about the cruelty of a social system that valued you only as long as you could maintain the expensive performance of fashionability. But Brummel wasn't alone in his fate. He's just the most famous example of a common phenomenon. Many young men of his era tried to emulate his style without having his initial resources. They spent money they didn't have on clothes they couldn't afford, trying to break into fashionable society by looking the part. Some succeeded. There are stories of tailors' sons or merchants' grandsons who dressed impeccably, behaved properly, and were accepted into circles above their birth. But many more failed, drowning in debt, ruined by their attempts to maintain an appearance they couldn't sustain. The gambling made it worse. Gambling was considered a gentleman's pastime. Cards, dice, betting on horses, wagering on everything from elections to whether it would rain. Fashionable clubs were essentially gambling establishments. You'd go to spend an evening, and by morning you might have won or lost thousands of pounds on the turn of a card. Some men had the wealth to absorb these losses. Others didn't. But they gambled anyway because refusing to gamble would mark you as unable to afford it, which was a social death sentence. There are accounts of young men losing their entire inheritances in a single night of cards. Estate books and family letters document the disasters. A son who lost the family lands at the gaming table, a brother who had to flee to the continent to escape gambling debts, a nephew who shot himself rather than face the shame of bankruptcy. The combination of expensive fashion and compulsive gambling was toxic. Both were forms of conspicuous consumption of displaying wealth and status. Both could spiral out of control, and both were nearly impossible to escape once you were caught in them. The tailors and bootmakers and shirtmakers were caught in a difficult position. They needed wealthy clients, but wealthy clients often didn't pay promptly or at all. Extending credit was necessary to attract business, but it exposed them to risk. When a fashionable gentleman went bankrupt, his creditors rarely recovered more than a fraction of what they were owed. Some tailoring businesses failed because they'd extended too much credit to men who couldn't pay. It was a precarious system, sustained more by optimism and social pressure than by sound financial practice. There's a memoir written in the 1830s by a London tailor that details this problem beautifully. He describes having several £1,000s owed to him by various gentlemen, some of whom he knew would never pay. But he kept their accounts open, kept making them clothes, because cutting them off would be admitting the debt was uncollectible, and it would also mean losing any future business. Better to hope they'd eventually pay, or that their heirs would settle the debts, than to write it off entirely. Meanwhile, his own suppliers were demanding payment, and he was juggling his own debts to keep his business afloat. It was financial instability all the way down. The social pressure to maintain appearances was intense. Your clothing was how people judged your status, your wealth, your very worth as a person. If you appeared in worn or outdated clothes, if you couldn't afford to follow the latest fashions, you'd be quietly dropped from the invitation lists, excluded from clubs, whispered about. Your credit would dry up. If you looked poor, people assumed you were poor, and they wouldn't do business with you. It created a vicious cycle. You had to spend money to look wealthy, but spending money you didn't have made you actually poor, which would eventually be discovered, leading to social and financial ruin. Some men tried to maintain the facade long after their money was gone. They'd have one good coat and wear it constantly, brushing and caring for it obsessively. They'd own one pair of boots and have them resoled repeatedly, polished to hide the wear. They'd change their cravat daily, but own only 3 or 4, rotating them through. They'd maintain memberships at expensive clubs they could barely afford because being seen in the right places was essential. It was an exhausting, anxious existence, always one unexpected expense away from being exposed. Always terrified someone would notice the subtle signs of poverty you were trying so hard to hide. The mental toll was significant. Contemporary accounts describe fashionable young men suffering from what we would now recognize as anxiety and depression, driven by the constant pressure to maintain appearances, the stress of debts they couldn't pay, the fear of social ruin. Some turned to opium or alcohol to cope. Some became reclusive, unable to face the social situations they could no longer afford to participate in properly. And some, as mentioned, took their own lives rather than face bankruptcy and shame. There's a surviving letter from the 1820s, written by a young man to his father, confessing that he had run up enormous debts trying to live fashionably in London. The letter is heartbreaking. He admits he's been spending beyond his means, gambling to try to recover his losses and only sinking deeper, charging clothes to his father's name without permission. He's terrified of being discovered, of bringing shame on the family, of ending up in debtor's prison. He's writing to confess and ask for help. We don't know how the father responded, whether he paid the debts or cut his son off. But the letter captures the desperation, the shame, the recognition that fashion and gambling and the need to fit in had led him to ruin. What's striking is that the system perpetuated itself despite these obvious problems. Everyone knew that living beyond your means was dangerous. Everyone knew about the bankruptcies and exiles and suicides. Moralists wrote essays condemning extravagance and warning young men about the dangers of fashionable life. And yet the pressure continued. The standards didn't lower. If anything, as the century progressed, the expectations became even more rigid, the need to conform even more intense. Why? Because fashion and status are relative. You're not judged in absolute terms, you're judged compared to others in your social circle. If everyone else is spending lavishly on clothes, you have to as well or you fall behind. It's a kind of arms race where everyone keeps escalating because no one can afford to be the first to stop. Economists call this a positional good, mouthing whose value comes from having more or better than others. No amount is ever enough because the competition never ends. Brummel's tragedy is that he helped create this system, then became its victim. He set standards so high that even he couldn't maintain them indefinitely. His influence made elaborate dressing essential, but his own financial ruin showed the cost of that expectation. And the sad thing is, his exile and death didn't change the system. Young men continued to ruin themselves trying to be fashionable. The cycle continued, but nothing lasts forever. The world that destroyed Brummel was itself changing. The rigid, expensive, appearance-obsessed culture of early 19th century masculine fashion was already beginning to crack by the time he died. New ideas about what it meant to be a man, new economic realities, new social structures, all were pushing toward a different model. The suit as we know it today, the relatively simple, standardized, affordable outfit that most men wear, was emerging. And while it had its own problems and constraints, it was at least less likely to drive you to bankruptcy. So as we conclude our long journey through the complications of men's fashion, let's look at how we got from there to here, from the world of cravats and waistcoats and financial ruin to the world of off-the-rack suits and casual Fridays. The story of how men's fashion finally simplified, genuinely simplified, not just pretended to, is the final chapter of this tale. Stand in front of your closet right now, in your mind at least, and look at what hangs there. If you're a man, or if there's a man in your life whose wardrobe you know, you're probably seeing variations on a theme. Dark suits, simple shirts, plain trousers, maybe a few ties. Colours mostly limited to blacks, greys, navy blues, the occasional white or pale blue. It's also uniform, so standardized, so safe. And you know what? That uniformity, that safety, that's the legacy we've been building toward through this entire journey. The modern man's suit, that simple, practical, relatively affordable outfit that billions of men wear today, was born from the ashes of the complicated, expensive, psychologically demanding fashion system we've been exploring. This is the story of how we got from 5-hour dressing rituals to throwing on a suit in 5 minutes, from hundreds of waistcoats to maybe owning 2, from financial ruin over fashion to buying decent clothes off the rack at reasonable prices. The transition didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, messy, uneven, with plenty of resistance along the way. But by the middle of the 19th century, the forces pushing towards simplification were becoming irresistible. Let's trace how it happened, because understanding this helps us understand the world we live in now, the choices available to us, and maybe even the choices we've lost. The Victorian era, roughly 1837 to 1901, the reign of Queen Victoria, saw the final consolidation of the dark suit as the standard for men. By 1850, the basic elements were in place: dark coat, matching or coordinating trousers, waistcoat, white shirt, dark tie. The variations that remained were mostly subtle: the cut of the lapel, the number of buttons, whether you wore a frock coat or a morning coat or an evening coat. But the overall impression was uniform. Put a group of Victorian gentlemen in a room, and from a distance they'd all look roughly the same. This uniformity was intentional. It represented a set of values that Victorian society held dear: sobriety, seriousness, modesty, focus on work rather than display. The flamboyant peacock men of the 1700s were seen as frivolous, effeminate, decadent. The Victorian ideal was the self-made businessman, the industrialist, the professional, men whose worth came from their achievements, not their appearance. And these men wanted clothing that reflected their values: practical, durable, unobtrusive, clothing that didn't distract from the serious business of making money and building empires. The fashion writer Gail Fisher, in her book Pantaloons and Power, describes the 1840s as the decade when men definitively abandoned claims to ornamentation, colours and decorative elements. She argues this was when fashion became exclusively the province of women, while men adopted a uniform style that changed little for the next century and a half. That's a slight exaggeration. Men still cared about their clothes, and subtle distinctions remained important. But she's right about the broad trend. men's fashion became boring, deliberately and systematically boring. The three-piece suit emerged as the standard. You've probably worn one, or at least seen them everywhere. Jacket, trousers, waistcoat, though by the late 1800s the waistcoat was becoming optional for informal occasions. The suit was made from matching fabric, usually wool in dark or neutral colours. Black for the most formal occasions, dark grey or navy for business, brown or tweed for country wear. That was about it. The rainbow of colours available to men a century earlier had been reduced to a narrow spectrum of darks and neutrals. But here's what's important to understand. This simplification was actually more democratic than what came before. The elaborate fashions of the 17 and 1800s were exclusive by design. Only the wealthy could afford them. Only people with servants could wear them. Only those with leisure time could maintain them. The dark suit was different. Yes, a bespoke suit from a top tailor was still expensive, but ready-made suits were becoming available, produced by factories using standardized sizing and mass production techniques. By the late 1800s, a working-class man could save up and buy a decent suit, something that would have been impossible a century earlier, when every garment had to be custom-made. The standardization also reduced the knowledge barrier. With elaborate fashion, you needed to know so many rules: what colours were appropriate when, how to tie different styles of cravats, which accessories were suitable for which occasions. It was a complex social code that took years to learn. The suit simplified that. There were still rules, certainly, but they were fewer and more straightforward. Dark suit for business, black suit for funerals. Don't wear brown in town, a rule that persisted well into the 20th century. Keep your shirt white. These were rules most men could learn and follow without years of study. The detachable collar, which we discussed earlier, became standard for suits in the late 1800s. This was partly practical. You could change your collar without changing your shirt, and collars bore the brunt of dirt and sweat, so they needed changing more often. But it was also economic. Manufacturing detachable collars in factories was efficient and cheap. By 1900 you could buy a dozen white collars for a fraction of what a single custom-made shirt would cost. The working man could maintain a respectable appearance on a modest budget. The necktie evolved too. The complicated cravats of the early 1800s gave way to simpler styles. The four-in-hand tie, which you probably know how to tie if you have ever worn a tie, became standard by the late 1800s. It's just a simple knot, nothing like the elaborate architectural constructions of earlier eras. You could learn to tie it in a few minutes, and while there were still men who fussed over their ties, it didn't require the hours of effort that cravats once demanded. Ready-made clothing was the real revolution. In the 1800s, if you wanted a suit, you went to a tailor who measured you, created a pattern specific to your body, cut the fabric by hand, and sewed the garment piece by piece. This took time and cost money, but the Industrial Revolution brought sewing machines, standardized patterns, and factory production. By the 1880s and 90s, you could walk into a department store, find your size from a rack of ready-made suits, buy it, and walk out wearing it the same day. The fit wouldn't be perfect. Mass production couldn't match the precision of the bespoke tailoring, but it was good enough for most purposes. This democratized fashion in a way that would have been unthinkable to Brummel and his contemporaries. A clerk, a shopkeeper, a skilled worker could dress respectably, could wear essentially the same style of suit as his employer or social superiors. The distinctions remained: quality of fabric, precision of fit, expensive accessories, but they were subtle. A working man in a good ready-made suit could pass in many contexts, where he would have been immediately identifiable as lower class in earlier eras. Clothing became less of a rigid class marker and more of a level playing field. World War I accelerated the trend towards simplification. Millions of men wore uniforms for years, getting used to standardized, practical clothing that required minimal maintenance and no thought about what to wear each day. When they returned to civilian life, they wanted simplicity. The elaborate formalities of Edwardian dress seemed absurd after the trenches. Soft collars started replacing stiff detachable collars. Lounge suits, basically what we'd call business suits today, became acceptable for occasions that previously required morning coats or frock coats. The rigid hierarchy of occasion-specific outfits began to break down. The 1920s and 30s era saw continued simplification. The waistcoat became optional rather than essential. Soft hats replaced top hats for most occasions. Ties became narrower and simpler. And crucially, the social consequences of fashion mistakes became less severe. You wouldn't be socially ruined for wearing the wrong thing. You might be seen as unfashionable, but it was survivable. The life or death stakes of earlier fashion had moderated. By the mid-20th century, the suit had achieved its final stable form. Single-breasted jacket with notched lapels, matching trousers with a pressed crease, white shirt, simple tie, dark leather shoes. This uniform, with minor variations, dominated men's professional wear for decades. It's what your grandfather probably wore to work every day. It's what businessmen and politicians still wear today when they want to look serious and professional. But something interesting happened in the second half of the 20th century: rebellion. The counterculture of the 1960s and 70s saw young men reject the suit entirely, embracing colourful, expressive, individualistic clothing. The Peacock Revolution brought back bright colours, patterns, decorative elements, a conscious rejection of the grey conformity of the suit. It didn't last, at least not in mainstream culture, but it opened possibilities. It showed that the suit's dominance wasn't inevitable or natural, but a choice. And in our current era, we're seeing something remarkable, a questioning of the entire system. Casual fitters became casual every day in many industries. Tech companies famously reject suits in favor of hoodies and jeans. Some men are experimenting with fashion again, breaking rules, trying new things. People like Billy Porter wearing gowns on red carpets, Harry Styles in dresses and pearls, designers creating menswear that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. The rigid boundaries are softening. Are we coming full circle, returning to an era when men can be decorative, can wear colours and patterns and express themselves through clothing? I don't know. The suit still dominates professional life in most fields. The cultural association between suits and seriousness, between dark clothing and masculine authority, remains strong, but the cracks are widening. The questions are being asked more loudly. Why should half of humanity be limited to this narrow range of expression? Why should men be denied the pleasures of colour, of decoration, of fashion, as play and creativity? Looking back at the entire journey we've taken together tonight, from the gold-embroidered waistcoats of the 1700s to the 5-hour dressing rituals of Brummel, from the tyranny of the cravat, the agony of tight trousers, from the spectacular expense of buttons and buckles to the financial ruin that excessive fashion could bring, what do we learn? Several things, I think. First, that fashion is never just about clothes. It's about power, status, identity, belonging. The men who spent fortunes on their appearance weren't being foolish or vain. They were operating in a system where appearance was genuinely important, where being impeccably dressed could open doors and secure opportunities. The clothes were tools, weapons, armor in social battles. Second, that the relationship between restriction and freedom in fashion is complex. The tight trousers and stiff collars were restrictive, yes, but they were chosen restrictions. Men submitted to them voluntarily because they valued the results, the perfect silhouette, the mark of belonging to fashionable society. The modern suit is less physically restrictive, but perhaps more psychologically limiting in its uniformity, its insistence that all the men should look roughly the same. Third, that democratization often means simplification. The elaborate fashions of the past were deliberately exclusive, designed to separate the wealthy from everyone else. Making fashion more accessible meant making it simpler, more standardized, less expensive. We gained access but lost variety. That's a trade-off worth thinking about. And fourth, that nothing in fashion is permanent. The rules that seemed absolute, the styles that seemed unchangeable, the systems that seemed natural, all of them changed. The powdered wig that was essential in 1780 was ridiculous by 1800. The cravat that required hours to tie was replaced by a simple necktie. The elaborate waistcoat collection was abandoned for a simple vest or no vest at all. If those things could change, anything can change. The suit's dominance, the restriction of men to dark, neutral colours, the association between masculinity and plainness, all of these could shift, are perhaps already shifting. So where does that leave us? With choices, I think. We inherit this legacy, the suit, the tie, the expectation of plainness and conformity. But we don't have to accept it unquestioningly. We can recognize it for what it is, a historical accident, the result of specific forces operating at a specific time, not some eternal truth about how men should dress. And recognizing that, we can make different choices. Wear the suit if it serves you, but don't feel imprisoned by it. Experiment if you want to. Reclaim colour, pattern, decoration if that speaks to you. Or embrace the simplicity if that's what feels right. The point is that it's a choice, not a requirement. The men we've met tonight, the aristocrats in their embroidered silks, Brummel obsessing over his cravat, the dandies sewn into their trousers, the bankrupts fleeing to France, they didn't always have choices. They were trapped in systems that demanded conformity, that punished deviation, that made appearance a matter of survival. We're luckier. We have more freedom. The question is whether we'll use it. Thank you for staying with me through this song journey into the past. I hope you found it as fascinating as I have, these stories of men and their complicated clothes, the absurdity and beauty and tragedy of it all. Fashion might seem trivial, but it never is. It's about who we are, who we want to be, how we present ourselves to the world. These men from centuries past were grappling with the same questions we face today, just with different tools and different constraints. If you enjoyed this journey, I'd love to hear from you. What surprised you most? What made you laugh? What made you think? Drop a comment below. And if you're curious about other strange corners of history, other forgotten stories that reveal something about who we are, well, I've got plenty more where this came from. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Because history is full of these wonderful, weird, illuminating tales, and I can't wait to share more of them with you. Until then, sleep well, and the next time you're getting dressed, take a moment to appreciate how simple it is compared to what men once went through. No servants to sew you into your pants, no hours wrestling with cravats, no financial ruin looming over your wardrobe choices. We've come a long way. Whether we've gone in the right direction, well, that's a question worth pondering as you drift off to sleep. Sweet dreams, everyone, and thank you for listening.